Imagine standing on a red dirt plain in the middle of Australia, the sun not yet fully risen, the air already carrying that dry mineral warmth that belongs to no other place on Earth. The ground beneath your feet is cracked in long geometric patterns, like the surface of something very old trying to tell you something you do not have the language for yet. There are no buildings here, no roads visible from where you stand, just that ancient red earth stretching in every direction to a horizon so flat and so wide, it makes you feel like you are standing at the center of the world. And in a very real and very strange sense, you are, because the people who have called this land home for longer than almost any civilization has existed on Earth are still here. Their blood still runs through living people. Their stories are still being told. Their footprints go back so deep into time that the numbers become almost meaningless. We are talking about lineages that reach back 60,000 years. Some researchers say 70,000. A few think the evidence pushes even further than that. And what makes Australia unlike anywhere else in the Southern Hemisphere is not just the age of those lineages. It is the fact that they survived. They survived intact. They survived connected. They survived in ways that no other ancient human population on Earth can fully claim. This is the story of the oldest blood on the planet. It is the story of a continent that was separated from the rest of the world, not just by ocean, but by time itself. And it is the story of what happens when you look beneath the surface of what we call history and ask a different question. Not, what did civilization build here? But what did these people know? What did they carry? What does their very existence tell us about who all of us actually are? If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and it fascinates me every time. Someone in Perth watching the sunrise through their curtains. Someone in Canada lying in bed at 2 in the morning. Someone in Japan on a lunch break they are spending in the dark. All of us connected by the same quiet pull toward the deep past, toward the stories that were never written down because the people living them had no need to write anything down at all. Now, here is the part that should stop you before we go any further. Because when most people think about ancient history, they think about Egypt. They think about Mesopotamia. They think about the great stone monuments of Central America, or the buried cities of the Indus Valley. They think about civilizations that left ruins, civilizations that carved their legacy into rock so that someone thousands of years later could find the pieces and start putting the picture back together. But Australia presents us with something completely different, something that challenges the entire framework through which we understand ancient human achievement. Because the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and the Torres Strait Islander peoples did not build cities. They did not construct pyramids. They did not leave behind temples buried under jungle. And for a very long time, the absence of those things was used as evidence that they had not achieved anything worth studying. That interpretation was not just wrong. It was one of the most catastrophic misreadings of human history ever produced. What those people built instead was something that stone cannot hold. They built knowledge systems of such extraordinary depth and complexity that modern scientists are still in the early stages of understanding what was encoded in them. They built astronomical knowledge precise enough to track celestial events across thousands of years. They built ecological management systems sophisticated enough to maintain the productivity of an entire continent for tens of thousands of years without degrading it. They built social and ceremonial networks that connected communities across thousands of kilometers of some of the harshest terrain on Earth. They built oral traditions so precise and so carefully maintained that stories recorded within them describe actual geological events that happened 10,000 years ago. Not metaphorically, literally. And underneath all of that, underneath every ceremony and every song and every story and every carefully maintained relationship between a human community and its landscape, there was something that modern genetics is only now beginning to map with any precision. Blood lineages of extraordinary age, genetic signatures that reach back to the very beginning of the human journey out of Africa. And the more researchers study those lineages, the stranger and more complicated the picture becomes. Let us start at the beginning. Not the beginning that most history books give you, where human civilization starts somewhere in the Middle East around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The real beginning. The moment when the first anatomically modern humans walked out of Africa and began the long, improbable journey that would eventually put people on every habitable patch of ground on the surface of this planet. The scientific consensus, built from decades of genetic research, holds that this out-of-Africa migration happened somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago. A small population, some estimates say as few as a few hundred individuals, crossed out of northeastern Africa, moved through the Arabian Peninsula, and began spreading along coastlines towards South Asia. These were not people in the sense that modern people imagine ancient people. They were fully modern humans, with the same brain capacity, the same emotional complexity, the same capacity for language and abstract thought that you carry right now. They were simply people in a world that had not yet filled up with other people. A world that was, in most directions, completely unknown. Now, here is where Australia enters the story in a way that changes everything. Because among those early migrants moving along the coastline of southern Asia, a group eventually reached the region that is now the Indian subcontinent and kept going. They moved through what is now Southeast Asia, through island chains where some of those islands no longer exist as they did then, because sea levels were lower during the Ice Age, and the landscape of Southeast Asia looked completely different. And somewhere between 60,000 and 65,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, a group of those people made the crossing into Sahul. Sahul was the name of the ancient continent that included what is now Australia and New Guinea and Tasmania, all connected as a single landmass by exposed continental shelf during the lower sea levels of the Pleistocene epoch. This crossing was not an accident. It was not people floating on logs who happened to drift to a new shore. It required intentional navigation across a stretch of open ocean that even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age was at minimum 60 to 90 kilometers wide. Some researchers think it may have been considerably longer depending on the route taken, and this is where the story gets its first truly astonishing layer, because that crossing into Sahul represents the oldest confirmed open water sea voyage in human history, by a margin of tens of thousands of years. The people who crossed from what is now the Indonesian archipelago into Sahul were not stumbling accidentally into a new world. They were crossing deliberately, they were navigating, and they were doing it 60,000 years ago, at a time when the rest of humanity was still in Africa, or barely beginning to move through the Arabian Peninsula. Think about what that means. When the ancestors of the ancient Egyptians were still tens of thousands of years away from being born, when the ancestors of the Mesopotamians were still wandering through environments that would not produce agriculture for another 50,000 years, a group of human beings was already standing on Australian soil, looking at a continent they had just crossed an ocean to reach, and beginning the process of learning its secrets. That is the foundation of the oldest continuous human culture on Earth, and the blood of those people is still here. Now, when geneticists began the serious work of analyzing Aboriginal Australian DNA, what they found confirmed the broad outline of this story, but added layers of complexity that nobody had fully anticipated. The genetic signature of Aboriginal Australians is extraordinarily ancient. It diverged from the rest of the non-African human family tree earlier than any other surviving population, which means that the genetic lineage represented in Aboriginal Australian communities today is in some ways the closest living genetic connection to those first out-of-Africa migrants that exists anywhere in the world outside of Africa itself. But there is more than that. And this is where the story starts to move from the ancient into the genuinely mysterious. Because the genetic picture that emerges from careful study of Aboriginal Australian populations is not a simple one. It is not just one ancient population arriving 60,000 years ago and sitting in place. There are layers, there are signals in the DNA that suggest the population history of this continent is far more complex than the simple model of one arrival and one continuous lineage suggests. And some of those signals point in directions that researchers are still arguing about today. One of the most significant and controversial findings came from a comprehensive genetic study that examined ancient human remains from various parts of Australia alongside modern Aboriginal Australian genomes and compared them to populations around the world. What the study found, among several things, was a signal suggesting that Aboriginal Australians share a small but detectable amount of genetic material with populations from South Asia, a signal that appears to date to somewhere around 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago, long, long after the initial settlement of the continent, long after Australia was thought to be completely isolated from the rest of the world. This was not supposed to happen. The conventional story of Australian prehistory held that after the initial arrival of people 60,000 years ago, the continent was effectively sealed off. The rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age flooded the land bridges and turned the low-lying coastal areas of Sahul into the Bass Strait and the Timor Sea, and the other bodies of water that now separate Australia from the rest of the world. And that was supposed to be that. A sealed population in a sealed continent, developing in isolation for 60,000 years, producing the extraordinary cultural and genetic diversity that makes Aboriginal Australian populations so unique and so important to the study of human origins. But the South Asian genetic signal said otherwise, and it did not arrive alone. Interestingly, researchers also noted that around the same period, a new stone tool technology appeared in the archaeological record across much of Australia, and a new animal arrived on the continent, the dingo. Australia has no native dog. The dingo is not a marsupial. It is a placental mammal that had to have come from somewhere else. And it arrived, the evidence suggests, somewhere around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. The same general time frame as that South Asian genetic signal. The same general time frame as the new stone tool traditions. 3 separate lines of evidence all pointing to the same moment in time, all suggesting that something happened around 4,000 years ago that brought new people or new ideas or both into a continent that was supposed to have been completely isolated. Nobody is claiming a mass migration here. The genetic signal is subtle. It represents a small contribution to the overall Aboriginal Australian genome. But its presence is real, and it has been confirmed by multiple independent research teams using different methodologies. And it raises questions that nobody has yet been able to answer definitively. Who were those South Asian individuals who contributed that genetic material? How did they get here? Did they arrive by accident, drifting on ocean currents, or deliberately? Did they integrate into existing communities, or did they establish their own settlements that eventually merged? And most intriguingly, what did they bring with them, and what did they take back? Because here is something that is sometimes overlooked in the discussion of this genetic signal. Contact is a two-way street. If people came from South Asia to Australia around 4,000 years ago, even in small numbers, then there is at least the possibility that people also went the other way. That Australian genetic material, Australian knowledge, Australian cultural elements made their way back to South Asia through whatever network of contact allowed those 4,000-year-old connections to form in the first place. The ocean that surrounded Australia was not a wall, it was a road. And ancient people, as we are learning over and over again, from genetic and archaeological discoveries across the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions, were far more capable of navigating that road than we previously imagined. Let us step back for a moment and look at the continent itself. Because to understand why Australia is so extraordinary from the perspective of ancient human lineages, you need to understand something about what this land is, physically and geologically. Australia is not just old in terms of human occupation. The continent itself is ancient in ways that most places on Earth are not. The rocks of the Pilbara region in Western Australia are among the oldest exposed rock formations anywhere on the surface of the planet. Some of them formed more than 4 billion years ago, when the Earth was less than half its current age. The continent has been geologically stable for so long that it has been worn down to a low, flat profile by hundreds of millions of years of erosion. There are no young mountain ranges here, no recent volcanic activity reshaping the landscape, no tectonic collisions throwing up new ridges. What Australia has instead is time, deep, raw, uninterrupted time baked into red rock and dry air. And the people who came here 60,000 years ago encountered that ancient land and began the long process of learning it. Not learning it the way a naturalist learns a place by studying it from the outside. Learning it the way you learn the body of someone you love, from the inside, from proximity, from constant attention paid over years and decades and generations and millennia. They learned where water hid in drought seasons and how to find it. They learned which plants were food in which seasons, and which were medicine, and which were dangerous. They learned the movement of every animal that shared the continent with them, and how to predict where those animals would be under different weather conditions, and at different times of year. They learned the signs in the land itself. The subtle slope of a ridge that meant runoff would collect in a particular low point. The presence of certain insect species that indicated water underground. The behavior of certain birds that functioned as ecological indicators for the health of a whole region. This was not intuition. This was knowledge. Systematic, tested, transmitted knowledge, accumulated across hundreds of generations, and encoded into the most resilient information storage system that humans have ever developed. The oral tradition, the song, the ceremony, the story. You have almost certainly heard the term songlines. It is one of those words that has passed from specialized anthropological usage into broader popular culture. And in the process, it has been simultaneously romanticized and simplified to the point where it sounds like a beautiful poetic concept rather than what it actually is, which is a functional technology. A songline, to put it in terms that do not do it full justice but at least gesture toward its reality, is a route across the landscape encoded in a sequence of songs. Each song describes a particular stretch of that route in terms of the physical features of the land, the plants and animals found there, the water sources, the spiritual significance of particular formations or locations. When you know the song, you can navigate the country. You can travel across thousands of kilometers of unfamiliar terrain by following the sequence of songs that describe that terrain, because the land you are traveling through will match the descriptions in the songs. The songs are the map. Now, what makes this genuinely remarkable from a scientific perspective is the precision and the durability of this system. Anthropologists and geologists working together have found cases where songlines encode accurate geographic information about landscapes that were transformed by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age more than 10,000 years ago. The songs describe coastlines and features that no longer exist on the surface of the land. They describe the shape of the seafloor as it was when that seafloor was dry land, before the waters rose and covered it. This means the songs were composed at least 10,000 years ago and transmitted accurately through song and ceremony and performance, without being written down, without any external recording medium, for more than 10,000 years. And they still contained accurate geographic information when researchers went looking for it. The implications of that are staggering if you sit with them long enough. We treat writing as the gold standard of information preservation. We treat the absence of writing as a marker of primitiveness, of a culture that had not yet developed the tools to preserve knowledge effectively. But here is a culture that preserved geographic information with scientific accuracy for 10,000 years using nothing but human memory, human voice, human ceremony, and human social structure. Not just one piece of information, not just one geographic fact. An entire continent-spanning network of knowledge about terrain, ecology, water, plants, animals, weather patterns, and astronomical navigation, all encoded in songs and stories and ceremonies and transmitted across hundreds of generations with extraordinary fidelity. That is not primitivism. That is a different kind of sophistication. And it is a kind of sophistication that the modern world, with its hard drives and its databases and its satellite mapping, is only beginning to appreciate in the last few decades. But the knowledge encoded in Aboriginal Australian culture goes even deeper than geographic navigation. And this is where the story starts to intersect with some of the most genuinely mysterious questions in the whole field of ancient human achievement. Because among the things that researchers have found encoded in Aboriginal Australian astronomical knowledge is information about celestial events and celestial bodies that, by rights, nobody in a pre-telescopic culture should have known. Let us talk about Wurdi Youang. This is a stone arrangement in Victoria, in southeastern Australia, consisting of more than 90 large basalt stones arranged in an egg-shaped or ovoid pattern, roughly 50 meters across. The stones were placed by the Wathaurong people, who have maintained their connection to this site and their knowledge of its significance across generations. What researchers found when they began studying Wurdi Youang carefully is that the stones are aligned in ways that mark the positions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes with impressive precision. The arrangement marks where the sun sets at the winter solstice, the summer solstice, and the two equinoxes. It functions, in other words, as a solar observatory, a calendrical device, a tool for tracking the movements of the sun across the year with enough accuracy to support agricultural planning, ceremonial scheduling, and ecological management. The dating of Wurdi Youang is contested. Some researchers think it may be as much as 11,000 years old, which would make it older than Stonehenge by several thousand years, older than the great megalithic astronomical monuments of Europe. If that dating holds up under further scrutiny, it would rewrite the conventional timeline of when and where humans developed the systematic astronomical observation that eventually led to calendar systems and the broader ordering of human life around celestial cycles. But Wurdi Yuang is not an isolated case. There are dozens, possibly hundreds, of stone arrangements across Australia that have astronomical alignments. Many of them have not been fully studied. Many of them are in areas that are sacred to the Aboriginal communities who maintain them and are not open to outside researchers at all. And the astronomical knowledge encoded in Aboriginal Australian oral traditions is far more extensive than the stone arrangements alone suggest. There are detailed records in oral tradition of variable stars, stars that change in brightness over time in ways that are not visible to casual observation, but become apparent when you watch the sky carefully over many years and generations. There are records of supernovae, of celestial events that left no other archaeological trace. There are constellation systems that encode practical ecological information, using the shapes formed by dark patches in the Milky Way, rather than the connected dot star patterns that Western astronomy uses, and using those dark constellations to mark the behavior and availability of animals across the seasonal cycle. The emu in the sky is one of the most well-known examples. The shape of a giant emu is formed by the dark dust lanes of the Milky Way and can be seen in the Southern Hemisphere sky. Different positions of the emu in the sky correspond to different phases of the emu's actual behavioral cycle on the ground. When the emu in the sky is in the position that indicates nesting, that means emus on the ground are nesting and their eggs are available. When the position of the sky emu changes, the behavior of the ground emu has shifted accordingly. The astronomical observation and the ecological knowledge are unified in a single symbolic system that is both scientifically accurate and practically useful. That is the integration of knowledge that characterizes the whole Aboriginal Australian intellectual tradition. Nothing is separate. The stars tell you about the animals tell you about the seasons tell you about the plants tell you about the water tells you about the land, and the land tells you about the ancestors who walked it before you and the obligations you carry to walk it with care. Now, let us talk about something that tends to get overlooked when people discuss Aboriginal Australian culture, which is fire. Because the relationship between Aboriginal Australians and fire is not just an interesting cultural footnote. It is one of the most significant land management technologies ever developed anywhere on Earth. And its absence from the landscape in recent centuries has had consequences that are still unfolding today in ways that are visible in the satellite imagery of bushfire seasons, and in the smoke that has, in recent years, crossed entire hemispheres. For at least 50,000 years, Aboriginal Australians managed the vegetation of the continent using carefully controlled burns. Not wildfires, not accidental fires, not the catastrophic megafires that have become a feature of modern Australian summers in the era of climate change. Planned, precise, small-scale fires set at specific times of year in specific locations to achieve specific ecological outcomes. To clear old grass and encourage new growth that would attract game animals. To create fire breaks that would protect particular areas from larger fires. To maintain the diversity of plant communities in a landscape that, without fire management, would tend towards specific vegetation types that reduce ecological diversity over time. To create the mosaic of different vegetation types and ages across the landscape that supports the greatest diversity of animal life and the most productive food gathering opportunities for human communities. This is not a simple or unsophisticated technology. It requires detailed knowledge of how different plant communities respond to fire, how fire moves through a landscape under different wind and humidity conditions, how long it takes a burned area to recover, and what it looks like at different stages of recovery, and how to use that recovery sequence to maximize the productivity of a landscape over time. It requires coordination between communities managing adjacent territories so that fires set in one area do not create problems in another. And it requires the transmission of all that knowledge accurately across generations, because a fire management system that operates on timescales of decades and centuries requires practitioners who know not just what their parents and grandparents did, but what happened many generations back in the same landscape. Ecologists who have studied the vegetation of Australia in historical records, in the accounts left by European explorers and settlers in the 18th and 19th centuries, describe a landscape that looked fundamentally different from what you see across most of Australia today. They describe open, park-like landscapes with grass between the trees, with high visibility and easy movement, with abundant animal life and productive plant communities. They describe a landscape that looks, in short, managed, not wild in the sense of untouched, but wild in the sense of an ecosystem at the peak of its productivity, maintained by the skilled and continuous attention of the people who lived within it. When that management ended or was drastically reduced, following the catastrophic population collapse of Aboriginal Australians caused by European colonization and its diseases and its violence, the landscape began to change. Vegetation that had been kept in check by regular burning accumulated into dense thickets. The mosaic of different vegetation types and ages began to homogenize. The fire regime shifted from many small manageable fires to infrequent, large, catastrophic ones. And the consequences of that shift are still playing out in Australian fire seasons that have become, in the 21st century, some of the most destructive and ecologically devastating events in the continent's recorded history. This is not a small thing. This is a continent-scale ecological experiment, one in which the removal of Indigenous fire management practices over the last 2 centuries has produced a landscape that is measurably less diverse, less productive, and less resilient than the one that existed when those practices were actively applied. And it is an experiment that argues, with the force of lived ecological reality, that what Aboriginal Australians were doing with fire for 50,000 years was not random or intuitive or primitive. It was systematic and effective and sophisticated in ways that took the Western scientific tradition until the late 20th century to even begin to understand and appreciate. The broader point here is critical. We tend to measure human achievement by what people build, by what they leave behind in stone and metal and ceramic. But the Aboriginal Australians measured their achievement by something different. They measured it by how long the land could sustain life, by how well the ecological relationships they depended on were maintained, by the health of the waterways and the animal populations and the plant communities that made their lives possible. And by that measure, 60,000 years without degrading the productivity of a continent is an achievement of a kind that no civilization that has left behind stone monuments and written records has come close to matching. The cities of the ancient world extracted resources from their surrounding landscapes until those landscapes could no longer support them, and then the cities declined. The agricultural civilizations of history have depleted soil, exhausted water tables, converted biodiverse landscapes into monocultures, and created the conditions for their own eventual failure. The Aboriginal Australians managed their landscape for 60,000 years, and it was still capable of supporting them when European colonization began in 1788. That is the real measure of their achievement. Now, we need to go deeper into the genetics, because the story of Australian ancient blood lineages is not just about the extraordinary antiquity of the population that arrived 60,000 years ago. It is about the internal structure of that population, which turns out to be far more complex and far more interesting than a simple founding event followed by 60,000 years of isolation would produce. The Aboriginal Australian population is not genetically homogeneous. It contains within it an extraordinary diversity of lineages, of genetic subgroups, of populations that diverged from each other thousands of years ago within Australia itself, and developed along separate trajectories before maintaining connections through the social and ceremonial networks that linked communities across the continent. Some of that internal diversity reflects simple geography. Australia is a large continent with diverse environments, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from coastal rainforests to central deserts to island archipelagos. Different populations in different environments experience different selective pressures and different demographic histories. Some populations went through bottlenecks, periods where the population size contracted significantly, and then expanded again, leaving genetic signatures in the form of reduced diversity or specific lineages at high frequency. Other populations seem to have maintained larger and more stable population sizes over long periods, preserving a greater diversity of lineages. But some of the internal diversity of Aboriginal Australian genetics tells a more complicated story. There are genetic signals within some Aboriginal Australian populations that do not fit neatly into the expected pattern of a founding population arriving 60,000 years ago and diversifying in place. These signals suggest that the population history of Australia involved multiple waves of movement, not just across the sea from Southeast Asia to the continent, but within the continent itself, as groups moved across the landscape over tens of thousands of years and interacted with communities that had been in particular regions for much longer. The genetic record is beginning to map some of those internal migrations, those internal interactions, those periods of contact and admixture between groups that had been developing separately within Australia. And what it shows is a continent-scale human population history of remarkable depth and complexity. What makes this particularly interesting from the perspective of the broader mystery we are exploring here is what it suggests about the nature of the social networks that connected Aboriginal Australian communities. Because for those internal migrations and interactions to produce the genetic patterns that researchers are now finding, there had to be sustained contact between communities across the continent. Not just occasional contact, not just chance encounters, but the kind of regular, structured social interaction that produces consistent gene flow between populations over long time periods. And that kind of contact in a pre-agricultural society required exactly the kind of continent-spanning social and ceremonial network that Aboriginal Australian culture maintained through systems like the songlines, through trade routes, through ceremonial gatherings, through the complex kinship systems that connected individuals and communities separated by thousands of kilometers to each other, as relatives with specific obligations and relationships. The genetics and the culture are telling the same story, in other words. A story of a continent-wide human network maintained over tens of thousands of years that allowed both genetic exchange and knowledge exchange to flow across vast distances, not the story of isolated tribes in separate territories with no knowledge of each other. The story of a continent-wide civilization, if you want to use that word, organized along principles completely different from anything that Western history recognizes as civilization, but no less systematic, no less sophisticated, and in some ways considerably more durable. Let us talk about the Mungo people, because when we are discussing the oldest blood lineages in Australia, we have to talk about Lake Mungo. Lake Mungo is a dry lake bed in far western New South Wales, part of a complex of ancient lakes called the Willandra Lake System, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The lake was full of water during the Pleistocene epoch, when the climate of interior Australia was wetter than it is today, and the shores of that ancient lake were occupied by human communities whose remains are among the most significant archaeological finds in human history. In 1968, a geologist named Jim Bowler was studying the geological history of the lake system when he noticed human bones eroding out of a lunette, one of the crescent-shaped dunes formed by wind on the downwind side of a dry lake bed. Those bones, which came to be known as Mungo Lady, turned out to be the cremated remains of a young woman who had been cremated and then buried, her burned bones deliberately gathered and interred in a grave. The dating of those remains eventually settled at around 40,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. 40,000 years ago, a human community was practicing cremation on the shores of Lake Mungo. Cremation, the deliberate burning of the body of the dead, the careful gathering of the remains, and their formal burial in a marked location. This is ritual behavior. This is evidence of a concept of death that goes beyond simple disposal of a body. This is evidence of belief, of ceremony, of the kind of spiritual and social response to mortality that we think of as distinctly and essentially human. And then, in 1974, Jim Bowler made another discovery at Lake Mungo, another set of human remains eroding out of the same lunette system. A skeleton of a male individual who had been buried in an extended position, lying on his back, with his hands folded together and placed over his groin. His body had been sprinkled with red ochre, the same iron-rich pigment that shows up in burial sites around the world at similar time depths, suggesting that the practice of honoring the dead with red pigment was a deeply ancient and widely shared human behavior. This individual, known as Mungo Man or Mungo Thrid, was dated to somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years old, depending on the dating method used. He is among the oldest known anatomically modern human remains found anywhere outside of Africa. But what made Mungo Man particularly significant and particularly controversial was what researchers initially found when they analyzed his mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed through the maternal line that is often used to trace population history. The initial analysis, published in 2001, found that Mungo Man's mitochondrial DNA did not match any living human population. It appeared to represent an ancient lineage that had no surviving descendants. The researchers who published this finding interpreted it as evidence for an older layer of human occupation in Australia than the standard model accounted for, suggesting that the population history of the continent was even more complex than the genetics of living Aboriginal Australians had revealed. This finding was hugely controversial. It was contested by other researchers on methodological grounds, with some arguing that the DNA had been contaminated or degraded in ways that produced a misleading result. The debate has not been fully resolved, and the original samples are now controlled by the Aboriginal community with cultural interest in them, who have declined further invasive testing in favor of preserving the remains for eventual return to country. But the episode illustrated something important about the study of ancient Australian genetics. The questions being asked are genuinely difficult. The evidence is fragmentary and contested, and the answers, when they eventually come, are likely to be more complicated and more surprising than any simple model anticipates. What is not in doubt is that the Lake Mungo people represent an early Australian population of extraordinary antiquity. Whether or not Mungo Man's mitochondrial DNA falls within or outside the range of variation found in living Aboriginal Australians, the fact that human beings were living sophisticated lives on the shores of a lake in interior New South Wales 40,000 years ago, practicing cremation and conducting formal burials with red ochre and deliberate body positioning, is not in dispute. And it tells us something about the depth of human cultural tradition in this continent that should change the way we think about what it means to be ancient. Now, here is something that does not get talked about enough when people discuss Australian prehistory: the question of what happened to the megafauna. Because Australia, when the first humans arrived 60,000 years ago, was not the continent it is today. It was a continent of giants. It was a continent in which the largest marsupials that have ever existed walked the landscape. A wombat-like creature called Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that has ever lived, that stood nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed up to 2.5 tons. A giant kangaroo, Procoptodon, that stood 3 meters tall and could not hop like modern kangaroos, but walked bipedally on single, large central toes. Megalania, the largest terrestrial lizard known to have existed anywhere in the world after the non-avian dinosaurs, a monitor lizard that reached lengths of perhaps 7 meters and would have been an apex predator of formidable capability. Giant flightless birds, giant wombats, giant echidnas, a whole ecosystem of giants that had been present in Australia for millions of years, and that disappeared, most of them, in a geological eye blink that corresponds in the fossil record with the arrival of humans. The timing of the megafaunal extinctions in Australia is one of the most debated questions in the field of quaternary science, which is the study of the last 2 million years of Earth history. The debate is between those who think climate change at the end of the Pleistocene epoch was the primary driver of the extinctions, and those who think human hunting pressure, the overkill hypothesis, was the primary driver. And the honest answer is that both factors probably played a role, with the relative contribution of each varying across different species in different regions. But here is what makes the Australian megafaunal extinction particularly interesting from the perspective of ancient human lineages. If humans were present in Australia 60,000 years ago, and the megafauna went extinct somewhere around 46,000 years ago, then the people who inhabited this continent in that period lived alongside Diprotodon and Megalania and the giant kangaroos. They saw those animals, they interacted with them, they hunted some of them, almost certainly, and were aware of others as competitors or dangers. And somewhere in the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australian culture, in the deepest and oldest layers of those traditions, there may be memories of those encounters. There may be descriptions of creatures that no longer exist anywhere in the world. There may be knowledge about how people adapted their lives and their land management practices to the world as it was before and during the extinction of the giants, and how they adapted again to the world those extinctions left behind. Some researchers have proposed that certain figures in Aboriginal Australian mythology, creatures described in the most ancient stories that do not match any animal currently living in Australia, may represent ancestral memories of the megafauna, a creature described in some traditions as a large, heavy, slow-moving animal that lived near water and could be dangerous has been interpreted by some as a possible memory of Diprotodon. A creature described as a giant reptile or serpent of land-dwelling type has been connected by some to Megalania. These interpretations are speculative and contested, and the researchers making them are careful to describe them as tentative hypotheses rather than established conclusions. But the possibility is genuine, and it is consistent with what we know about the extraordinary fidelity of oral tradition in Aboriginal Australian culture. If stories can preserve accurate geographic information about drowned coastlines for 10,000 years, why could they not preserve memories of giant animals seen 60,000 years ago? There is a river in the Kimberley region of Western Australia that has carved its way through some of the most ancient rock on the planet. The Ord River, the Fitzroy River, the Drysdale, rivers that flow through landscapes of such geological antiquity that the rock they run over was being formed while the rest of the world's continents were still in the process of assembling into configurations recognizable to us today. And the Kimberley, that vast and remote northwestern corner of Australia, is where some of the most extraordinary rock art in the world is found. Rock art that tells a story about human occupation and human imagination that stretches back so far into time that the word ancient does not really capture it adequately. The Gwion figures, sometimes called Bradshaw figures after the European who first brought them to wider attention in the 1890s, are among the most mysterious and most debated examples of rock art anywhere on Earth. They are painted on sandstone cliff faces and rock shelters across the Kimberley, and they depict human figures in a style of extraordinary artistic sophistication. The figures are rendered with a detailed attention to anatomy, to posture, to the rendering of clothing and ornamentation that is fundamentally different from both the earlier and the later rock art traditions found in the same region. They show people in motion, people performing ceremonies, people wearing elaborate headdresses and body ornaments, people with what appear to be tassel decorations on their wrists and ankles. The level of artistic and cultural information encoded in these figures is remarkable. The dating of the Gwion figures has been technically extremely difficult because the pigments used in their creation do not contain the materials that standard radiocarbon dating requires. Researchers have attempted to date them by dating wasp nests that were built over some of the figures, using the wasp nests as a minimum age marker. That approach has produced dates suggesting some of the figures are at least 17,000 years old. Other researchers have argued for dates considerably older, based on stylistic analysis and contextual evidence. The Kimberley Aboriginal community and cultural authorities have traditions associated with the figures that place their creation in the most ancient period of the dreaming. The conceptual framework through which Aboriginal Australians understand the origins of the world and the establishment of its fundamental features, which does not translate directly into a calendar date, but which signals that these figures are understood within living Aboriginal tradition as being from an extraordinarily remote time. What makes the Gwion figures so genuinely puzzling, so productive of the kind of quiet, late-night wonder that keeps researchers in this field returning to the question decade after decade, is the question of what happened to the cultural tradition that produced them. The figures are clearly the work of a sustained artistic tradition, not a single moment of inspiration, but a style that was practiced and maintained and developed over what appears to be a substantial period of time, and then it stops. The later rock art of the Kimberley, which includes the extraordinary Wandjina figures, the large-eyed, mouthless beings associated with the rain and clouds and fertility, is different in fundamental ways from the Gwion style. The tradition shifted. Whether that represents a change in the population, a change in cultural practices within the same population, or something else entirely, is a question that has generated enormous controversy and, at times, considerable heat. Because Some interpretations have touched on sensitive questions about the continuity of Aboriginal Australian culture and the political implications of different readings of the archaeological record. The traditional custodians of the Kimberley rock art have their own understandings of both the Gwion figures and the Wandjina, understandings rooted in their cultural and spiritual relationship to the landscape and its history. These understandings do not always translate neatly into the framework of Western archaeological interpretation, and the relationship between those two different ways of knowing about the past has been and continues to be a complex and sometimes difficult negotiation. But what everyone agrees on is that the Kimberley contains some of the most significant and most ancient examples of human artistic and cultural expression anywhere in the world. A gallery that stretches across hundreds of kilometers of cliff face and rock shelter, painted and repainted and maintained across thousands of years. A visual record of human presence and human imagination in this landscape that goes back further than most of the world's great museums can reach. Now, let us zoom out from the Kimberley and think about something that tends to make archaeologists either very excited or very uncomfortable, depending on their theoretical commitments. Let us think about the Denisovans. The Denisovans are, as of the time this script is being written, one of the most recently discovered and still most poorly understood branches of the human family tree. They were identified from fragmentary remains found in a cave in Siberia, the Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, the first of which was a finger bone fragment so small that it would fit comfortably on the tip of your own finger. From that fragment and a handful of teeth and other bone pieces found in the same cave and at a small number of other sites, researchers have extracted ancient DNA and identified a genetically distinct human population that was present in Asia during the period when anatomically modern humans were spreading out of Africa. The Denisovans interbred with modern humans, as did the Neanderthals, and the genetic legacy of that interbreeding is distributed across the living human populations of the world in a pattern that is deeply interesting from the perspective of Australian ancient lineages, because the populations that carry the highest concentrations of Denisovan ancestry in the world today are not Europeans, they are not East Asians. They are the indigenous populations of the island world between Southeast Asia and Australia, Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and to a significant degree, Aboriginal Australians. Some Aboriginal Australian individuals carry what geneticists call Denisovan admixture, at levels as high as 3 to 5% of their total genome. This is a higher Denisovan contribution than is found in any other modern human population that has been studied. What this means is that when the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were making their way through what is now the island chain of Southeast Asia, tens of thousands of years ago, they encountered Denisovan populations. They lived alongside them, or at least encountered them periodically, for long enough to produce children who carried genes from both lineages. And some of those children and their descendants were among the people who eventually crossed the sea and established the founding population of what would become Aboriginal Australian culture. The Denisovan ancestry in Aboriginal Australians today is a genetic fossil of those ancient encounters. A memory written in DNA rather than in words or stone, of meetings between populations that happened in a world that looked very different from the one we know. And here is the layer of this story that still generates genuine scientific excitement. Because the Denisovans are, in many ways, still a mystery. We have their DNA. We have a few fragments of bone. We do not have a good picture of their physical appearance, their full range of distribution across Asia, or the full story of their relationship with the modern humans they encountered. What we know is that they were present across a vast geographic range, from the Altai Mountains where their cave site is located all the way to what is now the Philippines, where a separate archaic human species called Homo luzonensis has been found at a very old date, and whose relationship to the Denisovans is still being worked out. We know that the Denisovans that the ancestors of Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians interbred with may have been a different Denisovan subgroup from the ones that interbred with the ancestors of East Asians, suggesting that the Denisovan population itself was diverse, spread across a wide area, and not a single homogeneous group. Some of the Denisovan genetic material that Aboriginal Australians carry has been associated with adaptations to specific environments. The most well-known case is a gene variant that helps Tibetans survive at high altitude, which turns out to be Denisovan in origin, and was acquired by the Tibetan population through ancient interbreeding. But researchers are looking at other Denisovan gene variants in other populations to see if they too represent adaptations, and the Aboriginal Australian case is one of the most interesting to study because the Denisovan contribution is the highest of any population outside Melanesia, and because the environments of Australia present a range of selective pressures that are quite different from the ones operating in mainland Eurasian populations. This is genuinely cutting-edge science. The field of ancient DNA research has exploded in the last 15 years, as sequencing technology has improved and become cheaper, and the picture being revealed is of a human past that is far more complex, far more interconnected, and far more interesting than the simple story of one population replacing another in an orderly march across the globe. The story of who we are, written in our DNA, is a story of encounters and mixings and separations and further mixings across hundreds of thousands of years and across every continent. And Australia, with its ancient founding lineage and its Denisovan admixture and its 4,000-year-old South Asian signal and its extraordinary internal genetic diversity, is one of the most important chapters in that story. Let us talk about something that sits right at the intersection of mythology and geology, and that, when you look at it carefully, reveals one of the most remarkable things about the nature of Aboriginal Australian knowledge. Let us talk about the flooding of the coastline. At the end of the last ice age, beginning around 20,000 years ago and continuing until roughly 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose dramatically as the ice sheets that had covered large parts of the Northern Hemisphere melted and added their water to the oceans. In Australia, this meant that the vast continental shelf areas that had been dry land during the Ice Age were progressively inundated by rising seas. The coastline of Australia during the last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age around 20,000 years ago, was dramatically different from today's coastline. In many places, particularly in the north and northwest, where the continental shelf is broad and shallow, the coastline extended many tens of kilometers further out to sea than it does today. Entire river valleys and lake systems that are now underwater were then dry land, inhabited by human communities. The flooding of those coastlines was gradual by human experiential standards, but relatively rapid by geological standards. Over the course of several thousand years, the sea rose by more than 100 meters in total, inundating enormous areas of land. Human communities living on those coastlines had to retreat inland, generation by generation, as the waters rose. Their campsites, their middens full of shellfish, their burial sites, their sacred places, all went underwater. Much of the archaeological record of the earliest Australian coastline dwellers lies beneath the ocean, inaccessible to conventional excavation, which is one of the reasons that the archaeological record of early Australian occupation is so much less complete than it might otherwise be. But the stories survived because the people who were displaced from those coastlines told stories about what had been lost, stories about places that are now underwater, stories about the shape of the landscape as it was when those places were dry land. And those stories, transmitted through the oral tradition with the extraordinary fidelity that characterizes the whole Aboriginal Australian knowledge system, have been preserved and carried forward across 10,000 years of living memory. Researchers studying Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have documented dozens of stories from communities along the Australian coastline that describe inundation events, stories about land disappearing under the sea, about places that people remember from the old stories that are now underwater, about features of the seafloor that match the geography of what the continental shelf would have looked like when it was dry land. And in several cases, researchers have been able to match specific geographic details in these stories to specific features of the underwater landscape as mapped by modern marine survey technology. In South Australia, for example, there are traditional stories from the Ngarrindjeri people about a time when Spencer Gulf and Gulf St Vincent, two large bodies of water that now indent the South Australian coast, were dry land, and about the flooding of those areas and the displacement of the communities that lived there. The geological evidence confirms that those gulfs were indeed dry land during the last glacial maximum, and were progressively inundated as sea levels rose. The stories are not describing an imaginary past. They are describing a real geological event that happened between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, and they have been preserved with enough geographic accuracy that modern researchers can recognize the match between the stories and the geological record. This is, when you stop and think about it carefully, one of the most astonishing things that anyone has ever discovered about the nature of human memory and human knowledge transmission. We are not talking about myths that capture the general idea that sea levels can change. We are talking about specific, geographically accurate descriptions of specific coastal features in specific places, preserved in oral tradition for 10,000 years, through somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 human generations, without writing, without maps, without any external recording medium beyond the human voice and the social structures that ensured the stories were told correctly and transmitted faithfully. The implications go beyond the purely academic. If Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have preserved accurate geographic information across 10,000 years, they may also have preserved information about other events, other phenomena, other aspects of the ancient Australian environment that we do not yet have any other way to access. Information about animal distributions and behaviors in the period before the megafaunal extinctions. Information about climatic events that left no obvious trace in the geological record. Information about population movements and social changes that predate any archaeology we have been able to do. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia are not just cultural artifacts. They are archives, they are data, and we are only beginning to learn how to read them. Which brings us to something that pulls the story of Australia's ancient blood lineages into a wider and stranger context. Because Australia does not sit in isolation in this narrative of ancient human mystery. The Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean to the west are surrounded by evidence of ancient human maritime capability that challenges some of our most comfortable assumptions about what pre-agricultural people were able to do and what they knew. And Australia, as the oldest continuously inhabited territory on Earth outside of Africa, sits at the center of that evidence as a kind of anchor point, the place where the most ancient lineages meet the most ancient questions. Consider the Pacific. The settlement of the Pacific Islands is one of the great stories of human achievement, and it unfolded in a way that keeps surprising researchers as new genetic and archaeological evidence comes in. The expansion of Austronesian-speaking peoples out of Taiwan, beginning around 3,500 years ago, moving through the Philippines and into island Southeast Asia and then out into the Pacific, is one of the best documented ancient migrations in the genetic record. These were extraordinarily capable seafarers who developed double-hulled canoes, wayfinding systems based on stars and waves and winds and bird flight patterns, and the social organization needed to send expeditions across open ocean with enough people and enough supplies to establish viable populations in uninhabited islands thousands of kilometers from their nearest neighbors. But the story of the Pacific is not only about those Austronesian migrants. There is an older and stranger layer beneath it. Genetic studies of populations in Melanesia, in the highlands of New Guinea, in the Santa Cruz Islands, in Vanuatu, and in a handful of other Pacific locations have found traces of an earlier population, a group that the geneticists who study them call the first peoples of the Pacific, who were present in the Pacific Islands before the Austronesian expansion arrived. These first peoples are genetically related to Aboriginal Australians and to the populations of New Guinea. They were, in other words, the descendants of that ancient migration that brought the first humans into Sahul 60,000 years ago, or closely related to those descendants, who had at some point expanded from Sahul into the islands of the Western Pacific. And then, as the Austronesian expansion moved through, these first peoples were largely, though not completely, absorbed into the expanding Austronesian genetic and cultural tradition. Their genes survive in the genomes of modern Melanesian and some Pacific Islander populations, as a reminder of an earlier human presence in the Pacific that predates the canoe cultures of Polynesia by tens of thousands of years. The question of when those ancient pre-Austronesian Pacific populations moved out of Sahul and into the islands is not fully resolved. Some researchers think it was relatively recent, perhaps within the last 10,000 years. Others think the signatures in the genetic data point to a much earlier expansion, possibly connected to the post-glacial sea level rise that forced coastal populations to become more maritime in their orientation and may have pushed some groups out to sea into the island world. We do not yet have enough ancient DNA from the right places and the right time periods to answer this definitively, but The existence of those ancient first peoples of the Pacific is not in doubt, and their genetic relationship to the founding population of Australia means that the story of Australia's ancient blood lineages extends beyond the continent itself into an island world that stretches across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. And then there is the Indian Ocean, because on the other side of Australia, to the northwest, the Indian Ocean connects the Australian coast to Madagascar and to the east coast of Africa. And the genetic and historical evidence of human movement across the Indian Ocean is extraordinary, and much less well known than the Pacific story. Austronesian-speaking peoples not only expanded eastward into the Pacific, they also expanded westward across the Indian Ocean and settled the island of Madagascar, which lies off the east coast of Africa and which had no human population until around 1500 years ago, when Austronesian migrants from the Indonesian archipelago arrived. The distance from Borneo to Madagascar across the full width of the Indian Ocean is more than 7,000 kilometers. The Austronesian settlers of Madagascar did not stop at convenient intermediate islands. They made one of the longest ocean crossings in pre-modern human history, arriving in an island they had never seen, carrying their language, their crops, their genetic material, and their cultural traditions from Southeast Asia to within a few hundred kilometers of the African coast. This matters for the Australian story, because those Austronesian seafarers who crossed the Indian Ocean were the maritime descendants of the same cultural traditions that produced the Southeast Asian populations that had contact with Australia going back to the ancient crossing into Sahul. The Indian Ocean was their world. They navigated it routinely in both directions, and there is genetic evidence, tantalizing and not yet fully resolved, that some of those Indian Ocean navigations touched the Australian coast. The Australian northwest, the Kimberley coast, and the coast of Arnhem Land may have been visited, traded with, or perhaps even temporarily settled by Austronesian navigators before the period of historical contact in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Makassar traders from what is now Sulawesi in Indonesia, who came to the northern Australian coast to harvest trepang, sea cucumbers, are historically documented from at least the 18th century and possibly much earlier. The genetic traces of their visits appear in the DNA of some Aboriginal Australian communities in the north, and the cultural exchanges that accompanied those visits left their marks in Aboriginal Australian material culture, ceremonial practice, and oral tradition as well. Now, let us pull the thread of the dreaming, because you cannot talk about ancient Australian lineages and ancient Australian knowledge without talking about the dreaming. And because the dreaming is one of the most profoundly misunderstood concepts in all of cross-cultural communication between Aboriginal Australian culture and the broader world. The word itself is a translation, an imperfect translation, of concepts that exist in different Aboriginal languages under different names and with somewhat different emphasis, but that share a core understanding that has no real equivalent in Western philosophical or religious thought. The dreaming is not a dream. It is not a mythological past in the sense that Greek mythology describes a past of gods and heroes that everyone agrees never really happened. It is not a spiritual realm separate from physical reality. It is not simply the period of creation that preceded human history. It is all of those things at once and also something that they do not capture. Because the dreaming is not only in the past, it is also in the present and in the future. The dreaming is the deep structure of reality itself, the order underlying the physical world, the web of relationships and obligations and stories that connects every feature of the landscape to every other feature, and connects every living thing to every other living thing, and connects the present moment to the moment of creation and to all the moments that will come after. A dreaming story is not just a story, it is a description of the world as it actually is, encoded in narrative form. When an ancestor being in a dreaming story walks across the landscape and creates a particular mountain or a particular waterhole or a particular species of animal through its actions, that story is not describing what the mountain or waterhole or animal looked like before the dreaming made them what they are. It is describing what they are in their deepest essence. The story is the truth of the thing, not the history of the thing. And because the dreaming is not in the past, but in the eternal present of deep reality, the stories are not old. They are always happening. They are happening right now, in the same way that the laws of physics are always happening, in the same way that the structure of reality is always present. This is why the concept of a sacred site in Aboriginal Australian culture is so different from the concept of a sacred site in most other religious traditions. A sacred site is not a place where something important happened in the past. It is a place where the dreaming is especially present, especially accessible, where the deep structure of reality is especially close to the surface of the everyday world. The ancestor beings who created those sites in the dreaming did not merely leave their mark there. They are there, in some sense that does not translate into English without becoming misleading. The dreaming is not absent from sacred sites. It is what those sites are. Now, here is the connection to ancient blood lineages that makes all of this more than just cultural observation. The relationship between specific communities and specific country. The term used by Aboriginal Australians to describe the land they are connected to by ancestry and by the dreaming is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic way of expressing attachment to a place. It is a real and specific and genealogically structured relationship. Specific families and clans and language groups are the custodians of specific tracts of country. That custodianship is not just a right, it is an obligation. It is an ongoing responsibility to maintain the dreaming stories associated with that country, to perform the ceremonies that keep the dreaming alive and active in that landscape, to manage the country in ways that respect its dreaming significance and maintain its ecological health, and to transmit all of that knowledge and all of those responsibilities to the next generation. This means that the relationship between specific lineages and specific landscapes in Australia is not just sociological or political. It is deeply interwoven with both the knowledge system and the ecological management system we have been discussing. The people who are the custodians of a particular stretch of country are the people who carry the specific knowledge of that country's dreaming stories, its ecological characteristics, its astronomical alignments, its sacred sites, its water sources, its plant and animal communities, and all the practical and ceremonial information needed to live within it and maintain it. That knowledge is not freely available to everyone. It is custodied. Different levels of knowledge are held by different people at different stages of their lives and their ceremonial development. Some knowledge is gender-specific, some is age-specific, some is restricted to individuals who have undergone particular ceremonies and reached particular stages of initiation. The knowledge system is structured by the same genealogical and ceremonial frameworks that organize the whole society. This has enormous implications for how we understand the persistence of that knowledge across 60,000 years. It did not persist because it was written down. It did not persist because it was stored in a library or a database or any external medium. It persisted because the social structures that defined who was responsible for maintaining it were themselves persistent. Because the relationships between families and country, between lineages and landscapes, between specific people and specific knowledge, were encoded in the deepest structures of the society, in the kinship systems, in the ceremonial obligations, in the very understanding of who a person is and what their life is for. As long as people continued to be born into those relationships and raised within those structures, the knowledge continued to be transmitted. And in many parts of Australia, despite everything that colonization did to those structures, it was. The resilience of Aboriginal Australian cultural knowledge across the colonial period is itself one of the most remarkable things in this story. Because European colonization of Australia, which began in 1788 and intensified dramatically across the 19th century, was catastrophic for Aboriginal Australian populations. Disease, violence, dispossession of land, forced removal of children from families, prohibition of language and ceremony, deliberate destruction of cultural practices. All of these things combined to produce a demographic and cultural disaster of staggering magnitude. The Aboriginal Australian population, which may have been somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people at the time of first European contact, collapsed to fewer than 100,000 by the early 20th century. Whole language groups went from thousands of speakers to dozens to none within a few generations. Ceremonial knowledge that had been maintained for thousands of years was lost when the people who held it died before they could transmit it in the customary way. And yet an extraordinary amount survived. Languages that were almost extinguished were maintained by the last speakers and are now being revived. Ceremonial traditions that went underground during the most repressive periods of colonial policy re-emerged when those policies ended. Knowledge about country that had not been practiced openly for generations came back when people returned to their country and found that the relationship between their lineage and that land had not been severed by their physical absence. The structural persistence of the kinship systems, the cultural frameworks, the deep logic of the relationship between people and country proved more resilient than the colonial project expected, because you cannot destroy a relationship between a people and a landscape simply by removing the people from the landscape. The relationship is in the blood, in the name, in the ceremony, in the very understanding of who those people are. It waits. And when the conditions allow, it re-emerges. This resilience is itself an expression of the extraordinary durability of the knowledge system we have been discussing. A knowledge system that has persisted for 60,000 years does not die easily. It has survived ice ages and sea level rises and megafaunal extinctions and climatic shifts of enormous magnitude. It adapted and persisted through all of those things. Colonization was catastrophic in ways those earlier challenges were not, because it struck directly at the social structures that maintained the knowledge, rather than at the environmental conditions in which the society operated. But the same qualities that had allowed the knowledge system to persist through environmental challenges, its deep integration into the fundamental structures of identity and relationship and obligation, also gave it some degree of resilience against social disruption, not enough to prevent enormous loss, but enough to prevent total extinction. And this is why the question of ancient blood lineages in Australia is not just a question about the past, it is a question about the present. The people who carry those lineages today are not museum pieces, not relics of a vanished world, not representatives of an earlier stage in some linear march of human progress. They are contemporary people with contemporary lives and contemporary challenges, who also carry within them, in their blood and their knowledge and their cultural identity and their relationships to specific landscapes, one of the longest and most extraordinary human stories on Earth. A story that is still being told, still being maintained, still being adapted and developed and passed on. Now, here is where the story of Australia's ancient blood lineages connects to something that most people who think about ancient mysteries have never heard of. Something that sits in the archaeological record of Australia and demands an explanation that mainstream archaeology has not yet been able to provide in a fully satisfying way. Let us talk about the Bradshaw mystery more deeply, and let us talk about some of the other anomalies in the Australian archaeological record that have made this continent, for researchers willing to look at the evidence without preconceptions, one of the most genuinely puzzling places on Earth. The Kimberley rock art has been mentioned, but the full picture of Australian rock art is so vast and so varied that no single survey can do it justice. There are estimated to be millions of individual rock art sites across Australia. Millions. In some regions, you cannot walk for long in rocky terrain without encountering painted or engraved surfaces. The sheer density and variety of the rock art tradition in Australia makes it, as an artistic archive, probably the richest and most complex in the world. And within that vast archive, there are specific sites and specific styles that present genuinely difficult questions. In South Australia, near the town of Lee Creek, there are petroglyphs, engraved rock art, that were made using a technique and depicting subjects that do not fit neatly into any known Aboriginal Australian rock art tradition. In the Northern Territory, at sites that are not well publicised for reasons of cultural sensitivity, there are rock art panels that have been dated to time frames that push against the edges of what we thought we knew about when specific artistic traditions developed in human prehistory globally. In Queensland, there are cave paintings depicting creatures that bear a passing and somewhat troubling resemblance to animals that, by rights, should not have been present in that part of Australia at the time the paintings were made. The interpretations of these anomalies vary enormously, from the sober and cautious to the frankly speculative and occasionally the wildly unlikely. But the anomalies themselves are real, documented by researchers who are not conspiracy theorists, but careful scientists puzzling over evidence that does not fit their models cleanly. And then there are the stone structures. Australia has stone structures. Not at the scale of Stonehenge or the Egyptian pyramids, but real, deliberate stone arrangements created by human hands that, in some cases, represent engineering of considerable sophistication. The Wurdi Yuwang stone arrangement, already mentioned, is one example, but there are others spread across the continent in locations ranging from coastal Victoria to the arid centre to the tropical north. Some of these structures appear to be fish traps or aquaculture facilities of considerable size and complexity. evidence of economic and engineering activities that challenge the conventional picture of Aboriginal Australians as simple mobile foragers. The stonefish traps at Brewarina in New South Wales are a particularly striking example. They consist of an elaborate network of stone walls, pens, and channels built in and across the Barwon River, covering an area of several hundred meters. The traps were designed to catch fish moving upstream or downstream at different times of year, to hold them in pools until they were needed, and to allow the management of fish populations across a wide area of river. The complexity of the design, with its multiple interconnected compartments serving different functions, represents a degree of engineering planning and ecological sophistication that is not what most people picture when they think of ancient Aboriginal Australian economic life. The Brewarina fish traps are widely recognized as among the oldest human-built structures in the world. Some dating attempts have suggested they may be as much as 40,000 years old, though this is contested. Even if they are considerably younger than the most extreme estimates, they represent an achievement of ecological management and engineering that has been maintained and used across an extraordinarily long period of time. Similar stonefish trap and aquaculture systems exist in other parts of Australia. In Victoria's Western District, there is a wetland management system centered on the town of Budge Bim, which was part of a vast and sophisticated aquaculture operation maintained by the Gunditjmara people. The system involved the construction of channels, weirs, and holding ponds across a wetland landscape to manage the movement of eels and other fish. It covered an area of hundreds of square kilometers and supported a dense, semi-sedentary population of Gunditjmara people who did not need to move constantly in search of food because they were farming their wetland. Recent research has dated the construction of the stone infrastructure of this system to at least 6,600 years ago, making it one of the oldest and most elaborate aquaculture systems documented anywhere in the world. For this recognition, Budge Bim was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2019. But here is what makes Budge Bim so important for our story. The Gunditjmara people and their aquaculture system challenges one of the central assumptions that has structured Western understanding of hunter-gatherer societies and their developmental trajectory. The assumption is that sedentism, permanent settlement in one location, only became possible with agriculture, with the deliberate cultivation of crops that created a food surplus sufficient to support a population that did not need to move. Agriculture, in this model, came first. Sedentism followed. And from sedentism came population growth, specialization of labor, social complexity, and eventually civilization. But the Gunditjmara at Budge Bim were living in permanent stone houses, in a semi-sedentary settlement pattern, maintaining an elaborate food production system 6,600 years ago, without agriculture, without crops, without domesticated animals other than perhaps the dingo in some limited role. Their food production system was aquaculture, the management of aquatic species in managed water systems, and it produced sufficient food surplus to support a population that did not need to move seasonally in the way that fully mobile hunter-gatherers do. It produced social and economic complexity without agriculture. It produced sedentism without crops. This is a genuinely important finding, not because it means Aboriginal Australians were secretly the same as agricultural civilizations. They were not. Their relationship to their landscape and their ecological management systems were profoundly different from those of agricultural societies. But because it means that the developmental trajectory of sedentism and social complexity that Western anthropology has assumed to be universal, the sequence of mobile forager to settled farmer to complex society, was not the only path. There were other paths. And Australia, as always, contains some of the most important evidence for those other paths. Now, let us cross an ocean, because the story of Australia's ancient blood lineages does not stay in Australia. It crosses the Pacific. It crosses in ways that will take us into territory that is genuinely contested, but that is supported by enough different lines of evidence that the mainstream narrative of complete oceanic isolation between Australia and the Americas is becoming harder to sustain in its strong form. The sweet potato is a tuber. It originated in South America, specifically in the region of present-day Peru and Ecuador, where it was domesticated by the indigenous peoples of the Andes somewhere around 8,000 years ago. The sweet potato is now one of the most important food crops in the world, particularly in Polynesia, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Africa. And the question of how it got from South America to Polynesia without European intermediaries is one of the more intriguing puzzles in the archaeology of ancient human seafaring. Because when European explorers arrived in Polynesia in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found the sweet potato already there, already established, already integrated into the food culture, already known by names that were similar across islands separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. And not just in eastern Polynesia. The sweet potato was present in the western Pacific, in New Guinea and parts of Melanesia, places considerably further from South America, and from which, if the spread had been driven by Polynesian voyaging, it would have arrived later and with less integration into the food culture. The genetic evidence of the sweet potato, studied in the last few decades with increasingly sophisticated molecular tools, tells a clear story. The sweet potato arrived in Polynesia from South America before European contact. It did not arrive by accident, washed on ocean currents. The ocean currents in the Pacific do not flow in the right direction to carry a sweet potato from Peru to Polynesia without human help. It was brought. Either Polynesian voyagers sailed east to South America and brought it back, or South American voyagers sailed west and brought it to Polynesia, or both. The two-way contact hypothesis is supported by some of the genetic evidence, which shows signals of South American ancestry in some Polynesian populations that point to contact somewhere around the 7th to 13th centuries. Contact that involved real interbreeding between South American indigenous people and Polynesian voyagers. Contact that left not just the sweet potato, but actual human genetic traces in the DNA of the descendants of the people involved. Now, what does this have to do with Australia? The connection is indirect but important. It establishes, beyond reasonable doubt, that the indigenous peoples of the Southern Pacific had been conducting long-distance ocean voyages and making genuine contact with South America well before European contact. It establishes that the Pacific was not a barrier to pre-modern human movement. It was a road, and if Polynesian voyagers were crossing the Pacific to South America, visiting, trading, interbreeding, and returning, then the broader maritime world of the Southern Pacific, including the waters around Australia, was in contact with the Americas in ways that most traditional histories have not accounted for. The Americas represent the other great chapter in the story of human ancient blood lineages, and it is a chapter that in recent years has been rewritten so dramatically by new genetic and archaeological evidence that the version of it that most people learned in school is now more or less obsolete. The old story went like this. The Americas were uninhabited until sometime around 13,000 years ago, when people crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to Alaska and moved south through an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets that covered most of North America during the last ice age. These people, known as the Clovis culture from the distinctive style of stone tools they left behind at sites across North America, were the first Americans. Everything else came after. This story started falling apart in the 1980s and 90s, and has now essentially collapsed under the weight of contrary evidence. The site of Monteverde in southern Chile, excavated by the archaeologist Tom Dillehay beginning in the 1970s, and dating to at least 14,500 years ago, demonstrated clearly that people were living in South America before the Clovis culture in North America. People cannot have been in southern Chile before the Clovis culture in North America, if Clovis was the founding culture. The chronology does not work. The Americas were settled earlier than Clovis, and people made it to South America before Clovis stone tools appear in the North American record. But the complete collapse of the Clovis first model has not produced a new consensus to replace it. What it has produced is a much more complicated and genuinely mysterious picture of how and when and how many times the Americas were settled. And some of the evidence pointing into the deepest layers of that picture is both genuinely astonishing and directly relevant to the story of Australia's ancient blood lineages. In 2015, a genetic study published in the journal Nature produced a finding that sent waves through the fields of genetics and American archaeology simultaneously. The study, led by David Reich and his colleagues at Harvard, analyzed the genomes of hundreds of indigenous people from across South America, looking for patterns in the genetic variation that would reveal the population history of the continent. What they found embedded in the genomes of some indigenous populations of the Amazon basin, in Botocudo people of Brazil, and in indigenous people from the highlands of Colombia and from Bolivia and from Peru was a genetic signal that matched most closely, of any population in the world, to Aboriginal Australians and to Papuans from New Guinea, not to East Asians, not to Siberians, not to any population that was known to have had contact with the Americas in prehistoric times, to Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, a signal of deep genetic relationship between some South American indigenous people and the people of Australia and New Guinea that could not be explained by any known migration route or any known period of contact. The signal was called genetic population Y, or population Y, because the researchers did not have a name for the people who had contributed it. They did not know who these people were. They did not know when or how they had reached South America. They did not know where they had come from before they got there. They only knew that the signal was real, that it had been independently verified by multiple analytical methods, and that it pointed to an ancestry connection between some Amazonian indigenous people and the populations of Sahul, Australia, and New Guinea, that predated the well-documented main migration of the ancestors of most Native Americans from Siberia. This finding has been the subject of intense research and intense debate in the years since its publication. Some researchers have proposed that population Y represents a separate early migration into the Americas that took a completely different route from the Siberian Bering crossing that brought the ancestors of most Native Americans, a route that somehow connected the populations of Sahul to a group of people who eventually ended up in South America. The logistics of how that connection could have been made are deeply unclear. There is no obvious route by which people could travel from Australia or New Guinea to South America without crossing either the Pacific Ocean, which represents a distance of many thousands of kilometers, or an enormous overland distance through Asia, a route which would leave genetic traces in Asian populations that are not found. Some researchers have proposed that population Y represents the remnants of an ancient source population in Southeast Asia or South Asia, a population that was related to the Sahulian peoples before the separation of Australia and New Guinea from mainland Southeast Asia at the end of the Ice Age, and that spread in multiple directions, some of its descendants ending up in Sahul and some of its descendants eventually making it to the Americas by an as yet undetermined route. This would explain the genetic similarity without requiring direct contact between Australia and the Americas, but it pushes the mystery back a level without resolving it. Other researchers have taken a more provocative position and suggested that the population Y signal represents evidence of a genuinely transoceanic connection, of human voyaging across the Pacific that predates the well-documented Polynesian expansions by tens of thousands of years. The basis for this suggestion is the combination of the genetic similarity, which is difficult to explain without either population contact or a very recent common ancestor, and the known ancient maritime capability demonstrated by the original settlement of Sahul 60,000 years ago. If people could cross the waters between Southeast Asia and Australia 60,000 years ago, why could their descendants not have crossed other stretches of ocean in the millennia that followed? This is a hypothesis that most mainstream researchers approach with extreme caution, not because it is inherently impossible, but because the evidence for it remains indirect, and the logistical challenges it implies are enormous. Crossing the Pacific from west to east against the prevailing winds and currents is dramatically more difficult than crossing it from east to west. Polynesian voyages going east to South America were moving with the currents and the winds for much of the journey. Going the other way, from Australia or New Guinea to South America, is a fundamentally different proposition from a navigation standpoint, but humanity has a track record of doing things that seem logistically impossible, and the demographic history of the Pacific is full of movements that once seemed impossible to explain. What is certain is that the population Y signal exists and requires explanation. The explanation is not yet available in a form that commands consensus. And this uncertainty, this genuine scientific puzzle sitting in the genetics of some South American indigenous people, is one of the most remarkable unsolved mysteries in the whole field of ancient human population history. A mystery that begins in Australia, crosses an ocean, and ends in the deepest jungles of the Amazon. a mystery that connects the oldest continuous human population on Earth to the people who were living in the Americas at a time so ancient that we're still arguing about exactly how ancient it was. Let us take a different angle now and talk about language, because the distribution of language families across Australia is itself one of the most remarkable and most important pieces of evidence for the antiquity and the diversity of the continent's human lineages. Australia has somewhere between 250 and 500 distinct languages, depending on how you define the boundaries between closely related varieties. This is an extraordinary number for a continent of this size, and the internal structure of those languages is equally extraordinary. The vast majority of Australian languages, something like 9/10 or more of them, belong to a single language family known as the Pama-Nyungan family. The Pama-Nyungan languages share common ancestry, common grammatical features, and systematic sound correspondences that demonstrate their relationship in the same way that the relationship between Spanish and Italian and Romanian demonstrates the common ancestry of the Romance languages in Latin. The Pama-Nyungan family covers almost the entire continent, from the Cape York Peninsula in the northeast to the far southwest, from the tropical coast to the arid center to the temperate south. It is the geographically largest language family in the world, covering roughly 90% of the Australian continent. But in the north of Australia, in Arnhem Land and the Kimberley and the Top End more broadly, there are a number of languages that do not belong to the Pama-Nyungan family. These non-Pama-Nyungan languages represent multiple distinct families, and some of them are language isolates, languages that do not demonstrably belong to any family at all, and that stand alone as unique linguistic entities with no known relatives among any of the other languages of the world. The non-Pama-Nyungan languages of Northern Australia are in many cases dramatically different from the Pama-Nyungan languages in their grammatical structure, their sound systems, and their vocabulary. They represent separate and ancient lines of linguistic development that predate the spread of Pama-Nyungan across the rest of the continent by an unknown but potentially very large span of time. The relationship between the Pama-Nyungan spread and the non-Pama-Nyungan languages of the north is one of the most debated questions in Australian linguistics. There are researchers who think the Pama-Nyungan expansion happened relatively recently in terms of Australian prehistory, within the last 5,000 years or so, spreading from a homeland in Queensland and replacing or absorbing earlier, more diverse languages across the continent. There are others who think the expansion happened much earlier, and that the non-Pama-Nyungan languages of the north are the remnants of that earlier linguistic diversity that persisted in the north because of the geographical and cultural isolation of that region. There are researchers who connect the timing of the Pama-Nyungan expansion to the South Asian genetic signal we discussed earlier, and the appearance of new stone tool traditions in the Dingo, seeing all of these as evidence of a significant cultural and possibly demographic event around 4,000 years ago that reorganized much of the social and linguistic landscape of the continent. What is clear from the linguistic picture, regardless of how those debates are eventually resolved, is that Australia's internal linguistic history is ancient, diverse, and complex in ways that reinforce the genetic picture of a continent with a long and complicated population history. The languages of Australia are not the product of a simple founding event followed by 60,000 years of undisturbed development. They are the product of multiple waves of internal migration, cultural interaction, social reorganization, and linguistic change across an enormously long time span. And embedded in those languages is cultural and ecological knowledge of extraordinary depth and specificity. Let us spend some time in the space of the genuinely forbidden. Not forbidden in the sense of hidden by conspirators or suppressed by governments, though some of what we are going to discuss has certainly been minimized or ignored by mainstream archaeology for reasons that are not always purely scientific. Forbidden in the sense of sitting outside the boundaries of what the conventional narrative about human prehistory wants to accommodate. Because there are discoveries in Australia and in the broader Southern Hemisphere story that genuinely challenge some of the most fundamental assumptions of mainstream prehistory, and those challenges have not always been received with the openness that good science requires. Consider the Jinmium site in the Northern Territory of Australia. In 1996, a paper published in the prestigious journal Antiquity reported new thermoluminescence dates for rock engravings and artifacts from Jinmium rock shelter. The dates were extraordinary. The rock engravings at Jinmium were dated to somewhere between 58,000 and 75,000 years ago, and artifacts in the sediments below the rock art were dated to as much as 116,000 years ago. If those dates were correct, they would push human occupation of Australia back to a period before the generally accepted date for the out-of-Africa migration itself, which would require a complete rethinking of the whole story of modern human expansion. The Jinmium dates were immediately and fiercely contested. Subsequent reanalysis using different dating techniques produced much younger dates for the site, in the range of 10,000 years old or less. The mainstream archaeological view today is that the thermoluminescence dates were unreliable due to various technical problems with how the sediments at the site responded to the dating method used. The Jinmium controversy has become, in the literature, a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting dramatic dating results without sufficient scrutiny. But here is what tends to get lost in that cautionary framing. The Jinmium dates were produced by competent researchers using a legitimate scientific technique. The reanalysis produced different results using different techniques. The technical debate about which methodology was more reliable in this specific geological context is genuinely complicated and has not been fully resolved in a way that leaves everyone satisfied. Some researchers who have looked carefully at the Jinmium evidence think the original dates, while possibly not exactly right, may not be as wildly wrong as the subsequent consensus has assumed. The full picture of what happened at Jinmium is not as clear-cut as the standard story of the Jinmium controversy implies. And Jinmium is not the only Australian site where the dating evidence is more complicated than the mainstream narrative likes to acknowledge. The earliest occupation dates for the Madjed Bebi rock shelter in Arnhem Land, which was re-excavated between 2012 and 2015 and produced dates as old as 65,000 years, push the envelope of what the standard model says is possible. The Madjed Bebi dates are accepted by most researchers, but they sit at the outer limit of the dates for human arrival in Sahul, and they imply a navigational crossing from Southeast Asia at a time when the human cognitive and technological toolkit was presumably not quite as developed as researchers previously assumed was needed for that crossing. The broader point here is that Australia, precisely because of the extraordinary antiquity of its human occupation, is a place where the standard models of prehistory are under constant pressure from the evidence, where the received narrative is always in danger of being disrupted by a new find, a new date, a new genetic analysis that points somewhere unexpected. This is not because Australian researchers are less rigorous than their colleagues elsewhere. It is because the questions being asked in Australia are older and harder than almost anywhere else, and the evidence is fragmentary and often ambiguous in ways that demand both rigorous methodological scrutiny and genuine intellectual humility about what we do and do not know. And now let us go to what is perhaps the most genuinely mysterious and most genuinely contentious zone in the whole story of ancient Australian lineages. Let us talk about the possible pre-Aboriginal settlement of Australia, about the idea, taken seriously by some researchers and dismissed outright by others, that there may have been a human presence in Australia, or at least in Sahul, before the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians arrived. A population, or populations, that left traces in the fossil record, and possibly in the genetic record of living Aboriginal Australians, traces that point to a more complicated founding history than the standard one migration model allows for. The evidence for this comes primarily from a group of skeletal remains found at Lake Mungo and at other Australian sites that have been described as morphologically archaic, meaning that their skull and body features look more primitive, more similar to archaic human species like Homo erectus than to fully modern, anatomically modern humans. These individuals have been given the informal name robust Australians in the scientific literature, to contrast them with the gracile or slender-boned remains that look indistinguishable from modern Aboriginal Australians. The robust individuals have thicker skull bones, more prominent brow ridges, and more pronounced facial features than the gracile individuals, and they appear to be, in at least some cases, as old as or older than the gracile individuals found at the same sites. The interpretation of these robust remains has been fiercely contested. Some researchers believe they represent simply the natural variation within a single modern human population that has been in one place for 60,000 years, with some individuals happening to retain more archaic-looking morphological features than others. Other researchers have proposed that they represent an earlier population, possibly related to the archaic humans known from Southeast Asia, notably Homo erectus and Homo floresiensis, who may have reached Sahel before the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians. On this view, the founding of Australia was not a single event, but a process involving multiple migrations, the first of which occurred at a very early date and involved people who were not quite anatomically modern. The early genetic analysis of Mungo Man's mitochondrial DNA, which seemed to show a lineage outside the range of variation of all living humans, was interpreted by some as supporting this multi-wave model. The technical problems with that analysis have led most researchers to set aside that specific finding, but the morphological evidence of the robust remains is harder to set aside. It is real skeletal material from real individuals, and the morphological differences between the robust and grey cell samples are real differences that require explanation. Whether that explanation lies within the range of normal modern human variation, in the documented reality that human populations show significant skeletal variation in response to different diets and lifestyles, or whether it points to something more fundamental about the founding history of the continent, is a question that has not yet been definitively resolved. What has emerged from all of this research and all of this debate is a picture of Australia's ancient human history that is more layered, more complex, and more interesting than any simple story. A story in which the first people to arrive in Sahul were extraordinarily ancient by the standards of any other human population outside Africa, in which those first arrivals may have been more diverse in their origins than previously assumed, with possible contributions from archaic human populations in Southeast Asia, in which a small but real genetic contribution arrived from South Asia around 4,000 years ago, accompanied by cultural changes that show up in the archaeological record, in which the Denisovan genetic legacy, acquired through interbreeding in Southeast Asia before the founding crossing, is higher in Aboriginal Australian genomes than in any other living population outside Melanesia, and in which the internal population history of the continent across 60,000 years has produced a genetic and cultural diversity that no single founding event and no simple model of in-place development can fully explain. This is the picture that genetics and archaeology, read together carefully and without preconceptions, is beginning to produce. It is not a tidy picture. It does not fit into a simple narrative, but it is a genuinely extraordinary one, and it points toward the conclusion that Australia is not just a place where ancient human lineages survived. It is a place where human history was lived in ways more diverse, more complex, and more rich than the conventional story has ever acknowledged. Let us think now about the pre-Columbian Americas. Because one of the most striking things about the story of ancient human lineages in the Southern Hemisphere is how it connects with a parallel story unfolding in the Americas that, in the last 2 decades, has been revealing a prehistory dramatically more ancient, more diverse, and more surprising than anything the standard textbooks contained. A prehistory that, in some of its most genuinely baffling aspects, connects back to the Australian story in ways that are still being worked out. The Americas were, in the conventional story, the last habitable region of the Earth to be settled by modern humans. The Bering Land Bridge crossing, the spread south through North America, the eventual populating of Central and South America, all of this was supposed to have happened in a relatively short window of time, starting around 15,000 years ago, and completing within a few thousand years of that. The people who did it, according to the conventional model, were a genetically relatively homogeneous group of Northeast Asians who crossed from Siberia in one, or at most, a small number of closely related waves. The DNA evidence has demolished that model, not by suggesting that Beringia was not crossed, it was, that crossing is well supported by genetics, but by revealing that the founding population of the Americas was not the homogeneous, recent Siberian-derived group that the conventional model assumed. It was already diverse before it crossed into the Americas, having accumulated genetic diversity during a population expansion out of Asia, and possibly had mixed with populations that had reached the region of Siberia from somewhere else entirely. and it carried in at least some of its lineages the population-wide genetic signal that eventually ended up in Amazonian indigenous populations, and that points, with a clarity that is genuinely hard to explain away, toward the populations of Sahul. But there is another layer to the American pre-Columbian mystery that does not come from genetics. It comes from archaeology, and it has been generating heat and controversy in the field for decades, because what it implies is so far outside the bounds of the conventional narrative that accepting it requires a very fundamental rethinking of what we thought we knew. In 2017, a paper in the journal Nature reported the findings from a site called Chiquihuit Cave in the mountains of central Mexico. The cave contained stone tools and other evidence of human presence that, when dated using various methods, produced dates of between 26,000 and 33,000 years ago. 26,000 to 33,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age, 15,000 to 20,000 years before the accepted date for the Clovis culture, the supposed first Americans, at a time when the ice sheets over North America should have made any crossing from Siberia and movement south essentially impossible. The Chiquihuit Cave findings were immediately controversial. Critics pointed to the possibility of natural processes moving artifacts through sediments, to dating uncertainties, to the need for independent replication. But the researchers who published the paper had anticipated these objections and addressed them methodologically. The tools were in primary depositional context. The dates were consistent across multiple methods. And Chiquihuit Cave was not the only site producing anomalously old dates for human presence in the Americas. In Brazil, the rock shelter of Pedra Furada has produced dates for human occupation extending back beyond 50,000 years. In California, a site called the Carudi Mastodon site produced what appeared to be a mastodon bone that had been processed by humans, with tool impact marks and other evidence of human activity, at a date of 130,000 years ago. The Carudi site dates are so old that, if accepted, they would require a completely different model of how humans reached the Americas. One that involves either a very early crossing of the Bering Land Bridge during a previous glacial cycle when that crossing was logistically feasible, or a different route entirely, perhaps a Pacific coastal route or even a direct Pacific crossing. They are not accepted by most researchers as firmly established, but neither have they been definitively refuted. What the accumulating evidence points toward is a picture of American prehistory in which there were human populations in the Americas substantially earlier than the conventional model allows, and in which the founding of the Americas may have involved not one population crossing from Siberia around 15,000 years ago, but multiple crossings at multiple times across a much longer span of prehistory, involving different source populations with different genetic signatures. This is the model that both the population Y signal and the archaeological anomalies support. And here is where this connects back to Australia in a way that is both intellectually fascinating and genuinely mysterious. If the ancestors of the population Y people in Amazonia came from somewhere that was related to the population of Sahul, and if human populations were present in the Americas at times earlier than the conventional model allows, then the question of how those people got there becomes genuinely open. Was there a route that connected Sahul, directly or indirectly, to the Americas at some point in deep prehistory? Was the Pacific Ocean, even in deep antiquity, less of a barrier to human movement than we have assumed? The coastal migration hypothesis, the idea that people spread along the Pacific Rim using coastal resources and island hopping capabilities developed in Sahul, offers one possible mechanism. Under this model, the descendants of the original Sahulian settlers could have moved northward along the eastern coast of Asia, following rich coastal environments, eventually reaching the far north and then moving across a Bering crossing or down the Pacific coast of the Americas, bringing their genetic signature with them. The problem is that this route, if it were taken early enough to explain the oldest pre-Clovis dates, would have to have been taken at a time when we have no independent evidence that Sahulian peoples were capable of the complex coastal migration it implies. Although, of course, if the earliest Sahulian settlers were capable of navigating the crossing into Sahul 60,000 years ago, the possibility of further maritime expansion cannot be ruled out simply on the grounds that we have not found direct evidence of it. The honest position here is that we do not know. The population Y signal is real. The pre-Clovis evidence in the Americas is accumulating and becoming harder to dismiss. The ancient maritime capability of Sahulian peoples is established. The mechanism that connects all of these things is not yet clear, but the probability that we have the complete picture of how the Americas were settled, that the conventional single crossing model captures everything there is to know, has become very low. Something older and stranger happened in the deep prehistory of the Americas than the textbooks contain. And the threads of that story, when you pull on them long enough, lead back toward the Pacific, toward the island world, and toward the oldest known human lineages on Earth. The connection, if it turns out to be real, and if it turns out to be direct rather than mediated through some lost source population in Asia, would be one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of human self-knowledge. It would mean that the people who first settled Australia 60,000 years ago, or their descendants, were also in some sense part of the founding of human life in the Americas. That the blood of those ancient Sahulian peoples, the oldest known non-African human lineage on Earth, flows not just in the Aboriginal Australians of today, but in the Indigenous people of the Amazon basin. That the oldest human lineage and some of the last major habitable territory to be settled by humans were connected by a chain of human movement and human contact stretching across the widest ocean in the world. If that is what the evidence eventually shows, it will mean that the story of ancient human history is not a story of isolated populations developing in parallel in separate corners of the world. It is a story of connection, of movement, of the extraordinary willingness of human beings to cross any body of water, climb any mountain, traverse any desert, and find out what is on the other side. Now, let us bring this back to something more immediate, more human, more grounded in the specific and the particular, because this is a story about people, not just about lineages and genetic signals and archaeological dates, about people who lived full lives, who loved their children and mourned their dead, who told stories and sang songs and managed landscapes and watched the stars. Let us spend some time with some of those people, as we can know them through the traces they left and through the living traditions of their descendants. Picture a woman standing on the edge of what is now the continental shelf of southern Australia. The water that will eventually cover that shelf and push it underwater has not yet risen. She is standing on land. To her left, behind her, is the continent she was born on. In front of her, where the ocean now is, there is more land, a broad flat landscape of grass and low scrub and occasional trees, stretching to a horizon she has never seen beyond, but that she knows from the stories of her elders extends further than any of them have walked. She is carrying something, a child perhaps, in a carrier made from bark and skin, or tools, or both. She's not thinking about the geological events that 10,000 years from now will put her campsite under 40 meters of water. She is thinking about water, actually, because it has been dry, and the places where she knows she can find water are getting harder to reach. She is thinking about the seasonal gathering that her community is preparing for, the meeting with neighboring groups at a particular location 3 days walk away, where the emu eggs are plentiful this time of year, and where the young people of both communities will meet, and some of them will pair, and the kinship ties between the groups will be renewed and strengthened. She knows the name of every significant feature in the landscape she can see from where she stands. She knows the dreaming stories associated with each of those features, the ancestor beings who created them, and the obligations those stories impose on the people who live near them. She knows where water hides underground near the roots of certain tree species. She knows the signs in the sky that tell her the season is about to shift, and that it is time to be moving towards certain plant communities where the fruits are ripening. She knows the kinship relationship she holds to every person in her community, and to every person in the communities they have regular contact with. A web of relationships that organizes her obligations and her rights and her place in the world with a specificity and a completeness that no legal system has ever matched for thoroughness and elegance. She does not know she is the ancestor of people who will live on this land 60,000 years from now. She does not know that her mitochondrial DNA will be passed down through her daughters and her daughters' daughters across hundreds of generations, carrying a genetic signature that researchers in the 21st century will study and find extraordinary. She does not know that the stories she carries, the song she knows, the knowledge of country that she maintains, will be transmitted forward across 10,000 years with a fidelity that will eventually allow those descendant researchers to reconstruct the geographic features of the landscape she's standing on, long after it has gone underwater. She does not know any of this. She knows her world, she knows her country, she knows her people, and she knows that she is responsible for transmitting what she knows to the people who come after her. That sense of responsibility, that fundamental orientation toward the future, toward the obligation to maintain and transmit and protect, is one of the things that most distinguishes the Aboriginal Australian relationship to knowledge and to country from the relationship to knowledge and to place that characterizes most of the Western civilizations that eventually came into contact with it. In the Western tradition, knowledge is a product, something you create and own and can trade and can let expire. In the Aboriginal Australian tradition, knowledge is a responsibility, something you receive from those who came before you and are obligated to maintain and transmit to those who come after you. The knowledge does not belong to you. You belong to the knowledge. You are its custodian, not its owner. This different relationship to knowledge is part of why the Aboriginal Australian knowledge system has survived as long as it has. Because a knowledge system that is understood as a product that can be created and destroyed and owned and lost is vulnerable in ways that a knowledge system understood as a living obligation is not. If knowledge is something you own, you can lose it when you die without passing it on, or it can be stolen or suppressed or made inaccessible. But if knowledge is something that defines your identity, that determines who you are and what your obligations are and where you belong in the web of life, then losing it is not just an economic loss or a practical inconvenience. It is a kind of death of self. And that means the motivation to maintain and transmit it is far more powerful than any external incentive that can be provided. This is one of the reasons why the revival of Aboriginal Australian languages and cultural knowledge that has been underway since the late 20th century has been as powerful as it has been. People working to revive their languages and their ceremonies and their ecological knowledge are not doing so primarily because it is politically important or economically valuable or strategically useful, though it may be all of those things. They are doing so because they understand it as a matter of who they are, because the knowledge connects them to their ancestors and to their country and to the dreaming in ways that nothing else can, and because the obligation to transmit it to their children and their grandchildren is not separable from the obligation to be who they are. Now, let us look at some of the specific ways in which Aboriginal Australian knowledge of the natural world has been proven in recent decades to be more scientifically accurate and more practically sophisticated than Western science initially credited. Because beyond the astronomical knowledge and the fire management expertise we have already discussed, there are other domains in which careful contemporary research has confirmed what Aboriginal Australian knowledge holders have been saying all along. Consider the question of water. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. The management of water, the knowledge of where it is and how to access it and how to store it and how to move it through the landscape has been a fundamental challenge for human communities in Australia for 60,000 years. And the Aboriginal Australian solutions to that challenge, developed across that full span of time, represent a body of practical hydrological knowledge that is genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint. In desert regions of Australia, Aboriginal Australian communities maintain sophisticated knowledge of water sources, distributed across enormous territories. Not just permanent water sources, which anyone can find, but the temporary and hidden sources that only become available under specific conditions. The soaks beneath dry riverbeds where water persists in the sand long after the surface flow has stopped. The roots of certain tree species that store water in their tissues and can be dug up and pressed to extract drinking water. The hollow branches of particular trees that collect and hold rainwater. The morning dew that condenses on certain rock surfaces and can be channeled and collected. The locations of underground water sources that can be accessed by digging at specific points in the landscape identifiable by surface features. All of this knowledge was systematically organized and maintained and transmitted across generations, distributed across a network of communities whose territories overlapped and intersected in ways that ensured no single group needed to hold all the water knowledge for their region. If a group moved into an unfamiliar stretch of territory in a drought, they knew they could rely on members of the community whose country that territory was to provide them with the water knowledge they needed. The social and the practical were inseparable. Knowing where the water was meant knowing whose country you were on and what your relationship to the custodians of that country was, and what the obligations of that relationship required of both parties. In the tropical north, the water management challenges were different, but no less sophisticated. Managing access to fresh water in an environment where saltwater intrusion, crocodiles, and seasonal flooding all presented challenges required different knowledge. But the basic principle was the same: detailed, systematically maintained, socially distributed knowledge of the hydrological characteristics of the landscape, maintained by communities whose identity was tied to their custodianship of that landscape. And the Budgebim aquaculture system we discussed earlier represents the apex of that water management tradition, the point where practical hydrological knowledge became the basis for a production system sophisticated enough to support a semi-sedentary population. Western hydrologists and water resource managers working in Australia have, in recent decades, begun to explicitly engage with Aboriginal Australian water knowledge as a complement to their own technical approaches, not as a romantic gesture toward traditional culture, but as a practical recognition that people who have been managing water in these landscapes for 60,000 years have observations and insights that no amount of instrumental monitoring and mathematical modeling can fully substitute for. The knowledge accumulated across that time span is itself a form of data, a record of how this landscape has behaved under a wide range of conditions, some of which have not recurred within the period of instrumental record keeping. Let us now think about Torres Strait Islander peoples, who are distinct from but related to Aboriginal Australians, and who represent a separate but equally ancient and equally important strand of the story of ancient blood lineages in Australia. The Torres Strait Islands are a group of more than 200 islands and reefs lying in the shallow strait between the northern tip of Queensland and the southern coast of Papua New Guinea. For most of the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were much lower than they are today, this region was not a sea. It was dry land, part of the broader Sahulian landmass that connected Australia and New Guinea. The populations on either side of what is now the Torres Strait were connected by land, could move freely between them, and shared aspects of their cultural and genetic heritage. As sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, the Torres Strait was progressively inundated, but the islands remained above water, and the communities that had lived in this transitional zone adapted to a maritime environment. Over thousands of years, Torres Strait Islander peoples developed an extraordinarily rich and sophisticated maritime culture, becoming expert navigators and seafarers in waters that presented formidable challenges with complex tidal patterns, extensive reef systems, and sudden violent weather that could develop without warning. They maintained trade and social connections with communities on both the Australian mainland to the south and New Guinea to the north, functioning as mediators and traders between two major cultural traditions. Genetically, Torres Strait Islander peoples represent a distinct population with a history that is related to but somewhat different from the Aboriginal Australian populations of the mainland. Their genomes show a mix of ancestry from both the Sahulian founding population of Australia and from the populations of New Guinea, reflecting thousands of years of contact and intermarriage across the strait. Some Torres Strait Islander populations also show traces of more recent Austronesian admixture, reflecting contact with the Austronesian-speaking peoples who moved through the island world to the north. This genetic diversity is itself a reflection of the geographic position of the Torres Strait, sitting at the meeting point of multiple major cultural and demographic streams. The material culture of Torres Strait Islander peoples, including their elaborate ceremonial traditions, their distinctive visual art, their musical traditions, and their astronomical knowledge, reflects this position at the confluence of multiple traditions. Some elements connect clearly to the deep Australian Aboriginal tradition. Others show influences from New Guinea and the Melanesian world. Still others reflect the specifically maritime orientation of communities whose whole life was organized around the sea. The result is a cultural tradition of remarkable richness and complexity, one that has survived colonization and its devastations in its own particular way, with its own patterns of loss and resilience and revival that differ in significant ways from the mainland Aboriginal experience. Now let us step back and ask the broader question that this whole story demands. What does it mean that Australia has more ancient blood lineages than any country in the Southern Hemisphere? What does it mean for our understanding of ourselves, all of us, wherever we are in the world? It means, first of all, that the concept of civilization, as we have conventionally understood it, is far too narrow to capture the full range of human achievement. We have defined civilization as something that leaves ruins, something that builds in stone and writes in clay, and organizes itself into hierarchical states with armies and priests and kings. And by that definition, much of what has been accomplished in Australia over 60,000 years does not count. But that definition is wrong, or rather, it captures only one possible form of human achievement, one that happens to have left the kind of material record that is easy for archaeologists to study and for historians to narrate. What Aboriginal Australians achieved over 60,000 years was something different, but no less significant. They achieved the longest continuously maintained relationship between a human population and a specific landscape in the history of our species. They achieved the creation of knowledge systems of extraordinary complexity and durability, systems that preserved accurate information about the physical world across 10,000 and more years without any external recording medium. They achieved the ecological management of an entire continent in a way that maintained its productivity and biodiversity across timescales that dwarf anything achieved by any other human civilization. And they achieved the creation and maintenance of social and ceremonial networks of continental scale that allowed genetic exchange, knowledge exchange, and cooperative resource management across distances that other civilizations required state bureaucracies and standing armies to manage. None of these achievements left ruins. None of them left the kind of material record that conventional archaeology reads easily. But they were achievements of genuine consequence, achieved by genuinely sophisticated people using genuinely sophisticated techniques, and maintained across a genuinely extraordinary span of time. The fact that we have taken so long to recognize them for what they are is not a reflection of any limitation in what was achieved. It is a reflection of the limitations of the framework through which we were looking. The second thing it means is that our understanding of the deep past of our own species is far less complete than we have generally assumed. The story of ancient blood lineages in Australia tells us that the out-of-Africa migration was more complex than the simplest models suggest. That the early settlement of Sahul involved people with ancient maritime capabilities we are only beginning to appreciate. That the internal history of the Australian continent across 60,000 years involved migrations and interactions and cultural changes of great complexity. That there may have been contact between Australia and South Asia 4,000 years ago. That the Denisovan ancestry preserved in Aboriginal Australian genomes is higher than anywhere else on Earth outside Melanesia, and that there is a genetic connection between some South American indigenous people and the populations of Sahul that points toward ancient connections across the Pacific that we do not yet understand. All of this tells us that the real story of human prehistory, the full story of who we are and where we came from and how we spread across this planet, is more complex, more interesting, and more extraordinary than anything the conventional textbooks contained. The picture we have is fragmentary. The questions are genuinely hard. The answers, as they come in from genetics and archaeology and linguistics and oral tradition research, keep surprising us. And the place where some of the most important surprises are concentrated is this ancient continent, this red-soiled, sun-baked, extraordinary place at the southern edge of the Pacific, where human beings have been living for longer than anywhere else outside of Africa, and where the oldest blood in the world, outside of the African continent where our species began, still flows through living people. The third thing it means is something personal, something that applies to each person listening to this, regardless of where they are from or what their own ancestry is. Because the story of ancient human lineages in Australia is ultimately a story about connection, about the fact that all of us, every human being alive today, are descended from the same small population that walked out of Africa somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago. The people whose descendants eventually became Aboriginal Australians, and the people whose descendants eventually became everyone else, were the same people at the beginning. They were the same community, breathing the same air, making the same kinds of tools, telling the same kinds of stories, conducting the same kinds of ceremonies. At some point, some of them went south and east, and eventually crossed the sea into Sahul, and their descendants became the Aboriginal Australians and the Torres Strait Islander peoples and the Melanesians. Other descendants went north and west and eventually filled up Europe and Asia and the rest of the world, and eventually found their way to the Americas and to every other corner of the planet. But we all started in the same place. We all share in our genomes the legacy of that same founding population. The genetic differences between us, differences that have accumulated over 60,000 years of separate development, are real, but they are small. We are far more similar to each other than the diversity of our cultures and our languages and our appearances suggests. When you look at the ancient blood lineages of Australia, you are not looking at something alien or remote. You are looking at your own distant past. You are looking at a chapter of the story that made you what you are. The people who crossed the sea into Sahul 60,000 years ago, those people are your ancestors too, in the sense that they were members of the same species at the beginning of its great global journey. What they accomplished, what they built, what they knew, what they transmitted across 60,000 years. All of that is part of the human story that includes you. There is a place in the Northern Territory of Australia called Kakadu. You may know the name because it is one of Australia's most famous national parks, listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for both its natural and its cultural values. But what the official tourism descriptions and even the national park literature often fail to convey adequately is the sheer temporal depth of human presence in this landscape. The rock art of Kakadu spans at least 20,000 years of continuous artistic tradition, 20,000 years, in a single landscape. The oldest images at Kakadu, now barely visible, pecked into rock surfaces that have had 20,000 years to be worn and weathered, depict animals and objects and activities that tell us about a world that was already ancient when ancient Egypt was young. Walking through the Kakadu landscape with someone who knows the dreaming stories of that country is not like walking through a museum. It is not a retrospective experience. It is an experience of a living relationship between people and place that has never been interrupted. That is happening right now in the same way it was happening 20,000 years ago, when someone stood at a particular rock face and began creating an image that would survive long enough for you to look at it today. The images accumulate on the rock faces across millennia, newer images painted over or around older ones, creating in some places a palimpsest of human presence so deep that no single researcher's career is long enough to document it all. The artists who created the Kakadu rock art were not recording history the way Western culture thinks of historical recording. They were participating in the dreaming. They were using the rock face as a surface for making the invisible visible, for rendering in pigment the relationships and stories and knowledge that structured their world. Some of the images have clearly practical components. Animals rendered with the kind of anatomical accuracy and behavioral specificity that suggests a detailed knowledge of the creatures depicted. Some of the images have clearly ceremonial significance. Some of them mark locations of spiritual importance with forms that express that importance without depicting it literally. And all of them are part of a tradition of visual expression and knowledge maintenance that has been ongoing without interruption for longer than most of the world's great cultural traditions have existed. When European settlers arrived in the Kakadu region in the 19th century, they encountered communities that had been in continuous residence in that landscape for a span of time so vast that the English language does not really have adequate words for it. The word ancient feels inadequate. The word prehistoric is technically accurate, but somehow minimizing. What we need is a word that conveys the combination of extreme temporal depth, living continuity, and ongoing vitality that characterizes this tradition. A word that acknowledges both the extraordinary antiquity of the lineages involved and the fact that those lineages are not extinct or fossilized, but living and active and still in relationship to the landscape they have been in relationship to for 60,000 years. That living continuity is what makes Australia's ancient blood lineages different from the ancient lineages that are studied in, say, Egyptian mummies or the skeletal remains of European cave people. Those lineages are dead in the straightforward sense that the people who carried them are gone and cannot speak for themselves. The Aboriginal Australian lineages are carried by living people, people with contemporary lives and contemporary voices and contemporary perspectives who also have access, in various degrees and forms, to the accumulated knowledge and tradition of 60,000 years of continuous habitation. Their antiquity is not a historical curiosity, it is a living reality. Now, let us think about something that sits at the edge of what conventional science is prepared to say, but that the evidence, when you look at it carefully, keeps pushing toward. The possibility that the knowledge systems of Aboriginal Australian culture contain information about the deep past of our species that is not accessible from any other source. Not just geographic information about drowned coastlines or ecological information about extinct megafauna, but deeper information. Information about how the human mind worked and what it was capable of before the development of writing and states and organized religions changed the basic cognitive and social environment that human beings operated in. Information about what a fully human mind looks like when it develops in a context of radical continuity with the natural world, without the disruptions and the abstractions that agricultural civilization introduced. The dreaming, as a philosophical and cosmological framework, is genuinely different from every other human philosophical and cosmological tradition that emerged in the context of agricultural civilization. It is not a creation myth in the sense that Genesis is a creation myth, a story about an event in the past that established the conditions for the present. It is a description of the permanent deep structure of reality, a structure that is always present, always active, always accessible to those who know how to attend to it. This is a fundamentally different ontology, a different way of understanding what the world is and what the relationship between human beings and the world is, from anything that has been developed within the Western philosophical tradition. And it emerged from 60,000 years of sustained attention to a specific landscape, sustained relationship with a specific ecology, sustained development of the cognitive and social tools needed to navigate a complex and challenging environment over an extraordinary span of time. Whether or not you accept the philosophical framework of the dreaming as literally true in any metaphysical sense, the fact that it emerged from that context is significant, because it suggests that human minds, operating under conditions of deep ecological embeddedness and intergenerational continuity over very long timescales, develop certain capacities and certain ways of understanding reality that are different from, and not simply less sophisticated than, the ways of understanding reality that emerge from the conditions of agricultural civilization. This is not an argument for abandoning modern science. It is an argument for taking seriously the possibility that there are things that 60,000 years of sustained attention to a landscape can reveal about the nature of that landscape and about the nature of human experience within it. Things that no amount of instrumental measurement and mathematical modeling can straightforwardly replicate. The scientists who are beginning to engage seriously with Aboriginal Australian knowledge are not doing so because they have abandoned their scientific commitments. They are doing so because they have recognized that the epistemological framework of modern science, while extraordinarily powerful in the domains for which it was developed, is not the only valid way of generating reliable knowledge about the natural world, and that a tradition of knowledge development that has been running for 60,000 years deserves to be engaged with as a serious intellectual tradition rather than dismissed as primitive myth. That engagement is still in its early stages. The methodological challenges are real and significant. The social and political context is complicated by the history of colonization and the ongoing inequalities that history created, but the direction is clear. The knowledge of the world's oldest continuous culture is becoming recognized as a scientific resource of global significance. In a specific domain, this is already happening in medicine. Aboriginal Australian traditional medicine has been documented to contain plant-based treatments for a wide range of conditions, treatments that in many cases have been validated by modern pharmacological research. The active compounds in plants used in traditional Aboriginal Australian medicine for wound treatment, for fever reduction, for the treatment of various infections, have been identified and in some cases have led to the development or the refinement of modern pharmaceutical products. The knowledge of plant medicine contained in Aboriginal Australian traditional culture represents tens of thousands of years of pharmacological research conducted through observation, experimentation, and systematic knowledge transmission. It is not a superstition. It is a body of empirically derived knowledge, developed using methods that are different from, but not less valid than those of modern pharmaceutical research. The same point applies to ecological knowledge. The engagement of Western environmental science with Aboriginal Australian ecological knowledge is producing genuine advances in our understanding of Australian ecosystems and how to manage them sustainably. The fire management knowledge we discussed earlier is the most prominent example, but it is far from the only one. Aboriginal Australian knowledge of plant phenology, of animal behaviour, of hydrological dynamics, of soil characteristics, is being engaged with by environmental scientists who have recognised that this knowledge base contains observations and insights that no amount of contemporary monitoring can replicate, because the events and conditions that generated some of the most important observations happened thousands of years ago and have not recurred since. Let us go somewhere specific now. Let us go to the Pilbara, that northwestern corner of Australia where some of the oldest rock on the face of the earth is exposed at the surface, where ancient red gorges cut through formations that were old before most of the world's mountains existed, where the heat is a physical presence for much of the year and the night sky is so clear and so dark that the stars seem close enough to touch. The Pilbara is home to one of the densest concentrations of rock art in the world, and also to some of the oldest. The engravings at sites like Murujuga, the Burrup Peninsula, constitute one of the largest and oldest collections of rock engravings anywhere on the planet. There are estimated to be more than 1 million individual engraved images on the rocks of Murujuga. 1 million. The range of ages represented spans from very recent to extraordinarily ancient. Some images depict animals that went extinct in Australia between 2,000 and 10,000 years ago. Some images have been tentatively dated to as much as 40,000 years ago. The images at Murujuga include depictions of animals and people and abstract forms that provide a window into the world, as it was across an extraordinary span of time. There are images of the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, a marsupial that went extinct on the Australian mainland around 2,000 years ago, but survived in Tasmania until the European period. The presence of thylacine images in the Pilbara rock art confirms that the engravers were working at times when the thylacine still roamed the mainland, and it preserves a visual record of a creature that most Australians in the modern era know only from a few grainy photographs and a short film clip of the last known individual, who died in captivity in Hobart in 1936. Looking at a detailed engraving of a thylacine on the rocks of Murujuga, you are seeing an image made by someone who watched that animal move, who knew its behavior, who had a relationship to it as a living part of their world. There are also images at Murujuga that have been interpreted as possibly depicting even more ancient creatures. Images of animals that do not match any species currently found in Australia, and that some researchers have cautiously suggested may represent memories of the megafauna, the giant marsupials and other creatures that went extinct in Australia between 40,000 and 46,000 years ago. If any of those interpretations are correct, then the engraving tradition at Murujuga extends back further than the extinction of the megafauna, and preserves within it visual records of creatures that no living human being has ever seen, maintained across 40,000 years of artistic tradition. This is, if true, an archive of biological and ecological knowledge so deep and so specific that nothing else in human history comes close to matching it. The Murujuga rock art is threatened. It is threatened by industrial development in the Pilbara, which is one of Australia's most economically significant regions, because of its vast deposits of iron ore. Mining and processing operations near the Burrup Peninsula produce chemical emissions that accelerate the weathering of the engraved rock surfaces, causing the images to fade faster than they would under natural conditions. There have been ongoing conflicts between the Indigenous custodians of Murujuga, the Ngaluma, Yinjibandi, Yaburara, Mardudunera, and Njamal peoples among others, and the industrial and governmental interests that have approved development in and around the site, with the custodians arguing that the damage being done to the rock art is irreversible, and that no amount of compensation or mitigation can restore what is being lost. This conflict illustrates something broader about the situation of ancient blood lineages, and the knowledge they carry in the contemporary world. The oldest human knowledge on Earth is held in communities that are, in many cases, economically and politically marginalized within the nations that nominally govern the territories those communities have inhabited for 60,000 years. The resources that would be needed to properly protect and study and engage with that knowledge are diverted to industrial and economic purposes that treat the landscape as a source of extractable materials rather than as a repository of irreplaceable human heritage. And the pace at which the material record of that heritage, the rock art, the archaeological sites, the ecological knowledge encoded in living landscapes, is being damaged or destroyed is not slowing. In many cases, it is accelerating. This is a genuinely pressing issue. Not in the sense that it requires some abstract moral response, but in the practical sense that the knowledge encoded in the ancient traditions of Aboriginal Australian culture is knowledge about how to maintain a productive relationship with this specific landscape over very long timescales. Knowledge that is directly relevant to the challenge of managing that landscape sustainably in an era of climate change and biodiversity loss. Losing that knowledge, or allowing it to be degraded to the point where it cannot be effectively transmitted and applied, is not just a cultural tragedy. It is a practical loss of information that the world cannot afford at this moment in its environmental history. Now, let us go back to the genetics one more time, because there is a dimension of the genetic story we have not yet fully explored that deserves attention. The question of what the ancient Australian lineages can tell us about deep human evolutionary history, about the processes that made us who we are as a species. One of the most interesting aspects of Aboriginal Australian population genetics is the pattern of selection that has left its mark in the genomes of these populations. Genes that are under natural selection, that provide a survival advantage or a survival disadvantage in a particular environment, leave distinctive signatures in the DNA of the populations that carry them. Signatures that geneticists can use to identify which genes have been under selection, when the selection occurred, and what selective pressure was driving it. And the selection signatures in Aboriginal Australian genomes tell a story about 60,000 years of adaptation to the specific conditions of the Australian continent. Some of those adaptation signals make intuitive sense. Genes involved in thermoregulation, in the management of body temperature in extreme heat. Genes involved in immune response to the specific pathogens found in the Australian environment. Genes involved in the metabolism of the specific mix of foods available in Australian ecosystems. These are the kinds of adaptations you would expect to find in a population that has been in one place for 60,000 years. They are the genetic record of 60,000 years of interaction between human bodies and the Australian environment. The slow accumulation of advantageous variants in specific genes through the differential reproductive success of individuals who happen to carry those variants. But some of the selection signals are less expected. There are signatures in Aboriginal Australian genomes pointing to selection in genes involved in social behavior, in the regulation of emotion and stress response, in the neural systems that underlie learning and memory, and the processing of complex social information. The interpretation of these signals is technically difficult and scientifically contested, but their existence points toward the possibility that 60,000 years of living in a particular social and cognitive environment, an environment organized around the specific demands of the Aboriginal Australian knowledge system, the ceremonial obligations, the kinship structures, the environmental management responsibilities, has left detectable genetic marks on the populations that lived in that environment. If that is true, and the caveats here are significant, but if it is true, then the ancient blood lineages of Australia are not just old. They are shaped, they have been molded over 60,000 years of coevolution between human biology and human culture into something that reflects the specific demands of that specific cultural and ecological context. The lineages carry within them not just the genetic legacy of the founding crossing into Sahul. They carry the accumulated biological response to 60,000 years of being human in Australia. This is a frontier of research, and the conclusions are tentative and incomplete. But it points toward a broader principle that applies across all human lineages and all human evolutionary histories. We are not only the product of our genes, we are the product of the interaction between our genes and our environments and our cultures across many generations. Human evolution is not just biological, it is biocultural. And the oldest and longest biocultural experiment in human history outside of Africa is the one that has been running in Australia for 60,000 years, producing blood lineages that are both ancient in their origins and deeply marked by everything that has happened to the people who carry them since the moment their ancestors first looked up at the unfamiliar stars of a new hemisphere and began the process of learning this extraordinary continent. There is something that happens to you when you spend time in the genuinely old parts of Australia, in the Kimberley or the Central Desert, or the ancient gorges of the Pilbara or the dry lakes of the Far West. Something that does not happen in any museum or any history classroom, or even in most of the world's other ancient landscapes. You begin to feel the weight of time differently, not as an abstraction, not as a number, but as a physical quality of the landscape itself. The light falls differently on very old rock. The silence in very old country has a texture that younger landscapes lack. The air feels like it has been breathed by more people than you can count, across more seasons than you can imagine, all of them attending to the same features of the land that you are attending to now. Aboriginal Australians have a concept, expressed differently in different languages, but present in recognizable form across the whole continent, that the landscape is alive, not metaphorically, not in the soft spiritual sense that some Western environmental traditions use when they talk about the living earth. Literally, the mountains and the rivers and the rocks and the trees are not just scenery. They are persons. They are beings with their own histories and their own agencies, and their own relationships to each other, and to the humans who share the landscape with them. And the humans who are the custodians of that landscape are in a reciprocal relationship with those landscape persons. They have obligations to maintain that relationship, to perform the ceremonies that keep the connections alive, to attend to the land in the ways that the land requires. This understanding of the landscape as alive, as personal, as in relationship with human communities, is so fundamentally different from the Western conception of land as resource or property that it is very difficult to translate across. But it has a practical correlate that makes it scientifically interesting, quite apart from its philosophical implications. Because communities that understand themselves as being in a relationship of reciprocal obligation with the landscape they inhabit tend to behave differently toward that landscape than communities that understand it as a resource to be extracted. They notice things about it that extractors miss. They respond to signals from the landscape that extractors ignore. They maintain practices that sustain the landscape's productivity over timescales that make no economic sense from a resource extraction perspective, but make perfect sense from a reciprocal relationship perspective. The practical ecological sophistication we have been discussing throughout this script, the fire management, the aquaculture systems, the water knowledge, the plant management, the astronomical observation applied to ecological timing. All of these flow from and are sustained by the broader cultural and philosophical framework that understands humans as participants in a living landscape rather than managers of a biological resource. The wisdom is not separable from the worldview. You cannot take the ecological management techniques out of their cultural context and apply them as algorithms, as toolkit items to be deployed by practitioners who do not share the deeper framework. They require the framework to be fully understood and fully applied. This is one of the most important lessons that the study of Australia's ancient blood lineages has for the contemporary world. Not just that Indigenous ecological knowledge contains useful practical information, but that the framework within which that knowledge is embedded, the understanding of humans as participants in a living world rather than as managers or exploiters of a natural resource, is itself the foundation of the long-term sustainability that the Aboriginal Australian relationship to the Australian landscape has demonstrated across 60,000 years. If we want to learn from that example, we need to engage not just with the practical techniques, but with the philosophical framework that makes them coherent. This is a challenge, a real and significant challenge, because the dominant global cultural and economic framework within which most of the world's decisions are currently made is so deeply different from the Aboriginal Australian framework that engaging with the latter requires not just an expansion of knowledge, but a transformation of perspective. It requires being willing to question assumptions so fundamental that most of us carry them without knowing they are assumptions. Assumptions about what constitutes knowledge, about what constitutes value, about what constitutes progress, about what constitutes a good life. Those are big questions. They are not questions that can be answered in a YouTube video, or even in 1,000 YouTube videos. But they are questions that the story of Australia's ancient blood lineages makes it impossible to avoid. because 60,000 years of continuous human occupation of a specific territory, maintaining that territory in a condition capable of supporting human life throughout the whole period, is an achievement that demands explanation. And the explanation points toward a set of values and a way of understanding the world that is worth taking seriously. Not as a museum piece, not as a nostalgic vision of an impossibly ancient past, but as a living tradition that still has things to teach, carried by living people who are still here, still transmitting what they know, still in relationship to the landscape their ancestors have been in relationship to, since before the first writing was scratched into clay in Mesopotamia. Now, as we move toward the end of this long journey through time and across oceans and through the deepest questions about human origins and human achievement, let us spend a little while with the question of what all of this means for the future. Because the most ancient human lineages on Earth are not just historical artifacts. They are living communities, living languages, living knowledge systems, facing contemporary challenges and making contemporary choices about how to navigate a world that has changed enormously since their ancestors first arrived in Sahul. The last half century has seen a remarkable transformation in the political and legal status of Aboriginal Australian and Torres Strait Islander peoples within Australian society. The 1967 referendum that gave the Commonwealth Government the power to make laws for Aboriginal people and that allowed them to be counted in the census was a landmark. Native title legislation in the 1990s began the process of legally recognising the ongoing land rights of Aboriginal communities. The establishment of ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, and its subsequent abolition and replacement by various other structures, reflects the ongoing and unresolved tension between the Australian state and the communities within it that have the longest and deepest connection to the land. The Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, calling for constitutional recognition, a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution, and the establishment of a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making and truth-telling, represents the most recent and most significant expression of Indigenous political aspirations and their ongoing engagement with the Australian state. None of these developments has fully resolved the fundamental questions about the relationship between the contemporary Australian nation-state and the communities whose lineages predate it by 60,000 years. Those questions remain live. They remain contested. They involve deep disagreements about sovereignty, about land rights, about cultural authority, about the meaning of recognition, and what genuine respect for the world's oldest continuous cultures actually requires in practical terms. But alongside those political and legal questions, there is a cultural and intellectual renaissance underway in Aboriginal Australian communities that is one of the most remarkable phenomena in contemporary Australian life. Languages that were down to their last speakers are being revived and taught to a new generation. Ceremonial knowledge that went underground during the colonial period is being reclaimed and re-expressed in forms appropriate to the contemporary context. Young Aboriginal Australians are finding ways to integrate their ancient cultural identities with full participation in contemporary Australian society without having to choose between being Aboriginal and being modern. This integration is not always easy. The pressures of economic marginalization, of the ongoing trauma of colonization's effects on communities and families, of navigating a society that has still not fully reckoned with the history of what was done and the ongoing inequalities it created are real, and they are heavy. But the creative energy being generated within Aboriginal Australian communities, in art and music and literature and film and environmental management and scientific research and legal activism and political organizing is extraordinary. And it is driven in significant part by the same sense of deep connection to lineage and to country that has sustained Aboriginal Australian culture through 60,000 years of change. Let us now bring in some voices from the edge, some of the stranger threads in the story of ancient Australian lineages that mainstream archaeology treats with varying degrees of seriousness, and that a genuinely curious mind cannot responsibly ignore. Because if you are going to understand the full scope of what makes Australia's ancient blood lineages so extraordinary and so puzzling, you need to be willing to sit with the genuinely uncomfortable questions. The ones that do not have clean answers. The ones that the conventional narrative has trouble accommodating. Consider the Yowie, The Yowie is a creature that appears in the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australian communities across a wide geographic range, from Queensland to New South Wales to Victoria to Western Australia. It is described consistently as a large, bipedal, hair-covered creature that inhabits forested and remote areas, that is shy of humans but occasionally encountered, and that is understood within Aboriginal tradition as a real animal, not a supernatural being. The encounters described in Aboriginal Yowie traditions are described with the same matter-of-fact specificity as encounters with other wildlife, with details of habitat, behavior, and physical appearance that are consistent across different communities in different geographic regions. Western researchers have largely classified the Yowie as folklore, as a mythological creature with no biological reality, comparable to the Bigfoot of North America or the Yeti of the Himalayas. But the consistency of the Aboriginal Australian traditions about this creature across a wide geographic range and across communities that did not have regular contact with each other deserves at least some scrutiny. Consistent descriptions of a large bipedal creature across a continent from communities that develop those descriptions independently suggests either that the creature exists or that there is something else going on, some shared feature of human psychology or shared ancient memory that produces consistent descriptions of a similar creature across different cultural contexts. The Bigfoot traditions of North America are relevant here because they present the same question in a different geographic context and with a more intense modern investigative tradition around them. The Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest of North America have traditions about large, bipedal, hair-covered creatures that go back as far as those traditions have been recorded. Those traditions describe these creatures with specificity about their behavior, their habitat, their relationship to human communities, and their significance within the Indigenous understanding of the natural world. They are not described as supernatural beings in most traditions. They are described as a type of being that shares the landscape with humans and that deserves the same respectful acknowledgement as any other inhabitant of that landscape. And here is where it gets interesting from the perspective of ancient blood lineages. Because the regions of the world where the most consistent and widespread traditions about large, bipedal, non-human beings exist, North America, Australia, the Himalayas, and certain parts of Southeast Asia, are precisely the regions where archaic human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, are known from the fossil record to have been present at times that overlap with the presence of modern humans. This does not prove anything. Correlation is not causation. But it raises the question of whether some human traditional knowledge about encounters with other members of the genus Homo, encounters that happened in the deep past when multiple human species shared the same landscapes, might have been incorporated into traditions about non-human but human-like beings, and preserved in those traditions across the long span of time since those other human species went extinct. This is an idea that is very hard to evaluate scientifically. You cannot test it directly. The fossil record is too sparse, the genetic record is too fragmentary, and the oral traditions themselves are not easy to date in ways that would confirm their antiquity. But it is an idea that sits in the back of the mind when you look at the consistency of these traditions across different cultures, across different continents, across different linguistic and cultural backgrounds that have no obvious historical connection to each other. The most parsimonious explanation for that consistency might simply be that these traditions tap into some deep feature of human psychological response to encounters with something that is like us, but not us. But the possibility that they preserve actual memories of actual encounters with actual archaic humans cannot be entirely ruled out. In Australia, the Yowie question connects to the broader question of the archaic-looking skeletal material we discussed earlier. The robust individuals from Lake Mungo and other Australian sites. If there was an early population in Sahul that retained some archaic-looking morphological features, and if that population persisted in the Australian landscape for some time after the arrival of the gracile, fully anatomically modern Aboriginal Australians, then there would have been a period during which both types of humans were present on the continent. A period during which encounters between fully modern humans and morphologically archaic humans were possible. A period that might have generated the traditions about a large, powerful, human-like but non-human being that have been maintained in Aboriginal Australian oral tradition for as long as anyone can document. This is very speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that the evidence, if you look at all of it together, makes difficult to avoid. And it is the kind of question that a genuine curiosity about the deep past, about what really happened in the Australian landscape across 60,000 years of human occupation, demands that you at least consider. Now, let us talk about something else that sits at the edge. The question of contact between pre-Columbian Australia and the civilizations of the ancient world. This is a question that mainstream archaeology treats with extreme caution, because the evidence for it is fragmentary and contested, and because diffusionist archaeology has a troubled history of producing claims not supported by the evidence. But the pendulum may have swung too far in the other direction, producing an overcorrection reluctant to acknowledge genuine evidence of ancient contact, even when that evidence is real. We know that Macassan traders from South Sulawesi were visiting the northern Australian coast regularly, trading trepang, sea cucumbers, for goods from Aboriginal Australian communities, for centuries before European contact. The archaeological and historical evidence for this is well documented. The genetic traces of those visits appear in some northern Aboriginal Australian genomes. The material culture influence of the Macassan visits appears in some Aboriginal Australian artistic and ceremonial traditions. The word in the Yolngu language for rupiah, the Indonesian currency, is borrowed from Macassan, evidence of long-standing economic exchange between these communities. But the Macassan contact documented in the historical record from the 18th and 19th centuries was likely the visible tip of a much longer history of contact between the Australian North and the maritime cultures of Southeast Asia. The argument that this contact began only in the 17th or 18th century, only when Dutch and later English records begin to document it, is not compelled by the evidence. It is compelled by the absence of earlier documentary records, which is a different thing. The same maritime networks that eventually brought Macassan trepang fishers to Australia may have been operating in some form for much longer. And the Indonesian archipelago sits between Australia and the civilizations of South Asia and the Middle East and East Africa in a geographic configuration that makes it a plausible intermediary for information and goods and people flowing between those civilizations and the Australian continent. There are objects found in Aboriginal Australian sites and traditions that some researchers have argued could reflect contact with the broader ancient world. Copper and bronze objects. Plant species that have potential South Asian origins. Artistic motifs that have parallels in Southeast Asian and even South Asian artistic traditions. Each of these potential signals of contact is contested. Each of them has alternative explanations, but taken together, the accumulation of suggestive evidence is more than the conventional narrative has been willing to acknowledge. And the 4,000-year-old South Asian genetic signal in some Aboriginal Australian genomes, which we discussed at the beginning, provides firm evidence that contact between Australia and South Asia was happening in prehistoric times, which makes the question of what else might have been exchanged across those same maritime networks a genuinely open one. We are not talking about the pyramids being built with outside help. We are not talking about ancient astronauts. We are talking about the real and documented capability of maritime peoples in the Indian Ocean and the Southeast Asian archipelago to conduct long-distance trade and contact across open water, and asking the question of whether that capability included reaching Australia, bringing goods and possibly people, and returning with goods and possibly knowledge that had its origins in the world's oldest continuously inhabited continent. As we draw toward the end of this long journey, let us return to the red dirt plain where we began. The sun is higher now, the day has warmed to that specific Australian warmth that feels like being held in something enormous and ancient and indifferent to the short span of human concern. The horizon is still as wide as it was, the silence is still as deep. But if you look at this landscape now, after everything we have discussed, you cannot see it the same way you saw it when we began. It is not empty. It is not silent in the sense of unpeopled. It is saturated. Saturated with 60,000 years of human attention, human knowledge, human ceremony, human story. Every feature of the landscape carries a name and a language that has been spoken here for longer than any city in Europe has existed. Every plant has been known and classified and used and transmitted in oral tradition across hundreds of generations. Every water source has been tracked and managed and named and sung about. Every rock formation has its dreaming story. Every animal has its seasonal pattern documented in astronomical tradition. Every horizon has been scanned by human eyes attending to it with the kind of sustained intergenerational focus that produces the deepest kind of knowledge it is possible to have about a place. The ancient blood lineages of Australia are not something in the past. They are not museum exhibits or archaeological curiosities. They are living. They are in the bodies and the minds and the voices and the relationships of people who are alive right now, in communities across this continent, transmitting what they know to their children, fighting for the rights that would allow them to continue doing so, creating art and music and literature and scientific research that draws on the deepest knowledge tradition on the face of the earth. When the first genome of a fully sequenced ancient Australian was published, one of the researchers involved described it as like opening a letter that had been waiting to be delivered for 60,000 years. A message from the very beginning of the human journey out of Africa, carrying within it information about who we were at the start and what happened to us as we spread across the world. The ancient blood lineages of Australia are that letter. They are not addressed only to Aboriginal Australians, though they are first and most intimately the heritage of the people who carry them. They are addressed to all of humanity. They tell us where we came from. They tell us how long human beings have been here and what we have been capable of for how long. They tell us that the story of human achievement is much older and much stranger and much richer than the conventional historical narrative has acknowledged. And they tell us something else. Something that becomes clear when you look at 60,000 years of continuous human occupation of a specific landscape and ask what made it possible. What made it possible was not technology, in the sense that we usually use that word. It was not military power or political organization or economic sophistication. What made it possible was knowledge. Deep, specific, systematically maintained and transmitted knowledge of how to live in relationship with a specific landscape over very long timescales. Knowledge of how to take what the land offers without taking more than it can sustainably provide. Knowledge of how to read the signals the land sends about its condition and respond appropriately. Knowledge of how to organize human social life in ways that distribute that knowledge and the responsibility for maintaining it across a whole society, so that no single individual's death represents an irreplaceable loss. That knowledge, that way of knowing, that relationship between humans and the places they inhabit, is the oldest and most durable intellectual tradition on Earth. It has outlasted every civilization that has ever been built. It has survived ice ages and megafaunal extinctions and rising seas and years of colonization. And it still exists in living communities, in living languages, in living ceremonies, and living landscapes, and living relationships between people and the country they have been in relationship with for 60,000 years. The story of Australia's ancient blood lineages is not a story about the past. It is a story about what it means to be human over the longest possible timescale. What we are capable of knowing and caring for and transmitting to the people who come after us. It is a story about the kind of intelligence that 60,000 years of sustained attention to a specific place can produce. And it is, in the deepest sense, a story about love. Love of country, love of story, love of the ancestors who walked this land before us, and the obligation to walk it well enough that our descendants will still be able to walk it after us. The stars are coming out now. The same stars that the first people to stand on this continent looked up at and began the long, patient work of learning to read. The same stars that the painters of the caves looked up at and encoded in ceremony. The same stars that navigators across the Pacific read to find their way across the world's widest ocean. The same stars that are above you right now, wherever you are, whether you can see them through the roof and the clouds and the city lights or not. They have been watching all of this for longer than any human story can contain. The ice ages and the sea rises, the crossings and the paintings, the songs and the ceremonies and the fires that have been burning on this continent for 60,000 years. They will be watching long after the last of the stories we told tonight has been forgotten, or transformed beyond recognition, or transmitted in some form we cannot yet imagine to people who will be as far from us in time as we are from the first footsteps on Australian soil. But for right now, you're here, and the story of the oldest blood on Earth is part of your story. And somewhere on the red earth of the oldest continent, someone is awake and tending a fire and looking up at those same stars and remembering something that was passed to them by the people who came before, something that will be passed on to the people who come after, something that has been passing person to person, generation to generation, in an unbroken chain that goes back further than any other human story on Earth. That chain is the most remarkable thing about Australia, not the minerals in its ground, though they are extraordinary, not the unique species in its ecosystems, though they are extraordinary, not even the breathtaking age of its rocks. The most remarkable thing about Australia is that chain, that living chain of knowledge and story and relationship and blood, running back 60,000 years without a break, to the moment when the first human being stood on this soil and began the long, patient, extraordinary work of coming to know it. That chain is still unbroken, and as long as it is, the oldest blood lineages on Earth are still here, still teaching, still transmitting, still witnessing the passage of time with the steady ancient attention that only 60,000 years of practice can produce. If you made it to the end of this journey, this long road through time and blood and ocean and story, thank you. There is something profound about sitting in the dark and letting your mind travel back this far into questions this old. If this felt like it found something real in you, consider leaving a comment. Tell me where in the world you're listening from right now. Tell me what time it is there. Those comments matter more than you know. They remind me that somewhere out there, in dozens of time zones and quiet late night spaces, people are still doing what humans have always done. They are gathering around a fire, and they are listening to the story, as they have always done, as they have always found their way back to the fire, as they always will.